Get comfortable. However you happen to be lying right now, let yourself settle a little deeper into it. Unclench your jaw. Let your shoulders come down away from your ears. For the next few hours, there is nothing for you to solve and nowhere for you to be. There is only your breathing, slow and even, the weight of the blankets over you, and the sound of this voice carrying a long story that begins in the dark and ends, many years later, in the morning light. We are going back to a castle in the mountains of Scotland. On the morning after the longest night it had ever known, the battle ended just before dawn. For most of that night, the corridors had been full of green light and falling stone, of running feet and people calling names into the smoke. And then, between one breath and the next, it was over. The man who had called himself Lord Voldemort lay dead on the floor of the great hall, ended by his own curse turned back against him, and the quiet that came rushing in to fill the space he left was so total that the people still standing did not quite believe in it. Nobody cheered, not at first. They stood where they were, swaying a little on their feet, and waited to see whether the world was really going to let them stop. Outside, the sky over the mountains had begun to turn from black to the colour of wet slate. A bird started up somewhere in the half-broken rafters above the hall, thin and ordinary, the same few notes it would have sung on any other morning of its life. It did not know what had happened beneath it. To the bird, it was only a morning, like all the others. Before we go any further, while you are still awake enough to do it, I want to ask you one small thing. If you find, as this night goes on, that the sound of this voice helps you drift down towards sleep, then reach out now and tap the subscribe button below. You do not need to open your eyes for more than a moment. It costs you nothing at all, and it means that on some other night, when sleep is slow to come and the dark feels a little too wide, a story like this one will be able to find its way back to you. That is the only thing I will ask of you tonight. Let your hand fall again. Let your eyes close. We will go on together from here. The great hall in that grey first light was a solemn place to stand. 4 long house tables, the ones that had kept their places, for as long as anyone living could remember, had been shoved back against the walls or overturned where people had taken cover behind them. High overhead, the enchanted ceiling that usually showed the weather outside had gone dim and slow and uncertain, as if it too had stayed up all night and could no longer hold a clear picture of the sky. The room was full of people, and yet it was hushed, because down the centre of the floor, laid out in a long and careful row, were the ones who had not lived to see the morning come. There were around 50 of them. Their families and their friends knelt beside them on the cold flagstones, and the sounds those people made were not loud. A mother smoothing the hair back from a still face, a father holding a hand that would not hold his back. Somebody further down the row repeating a name over and over in a low voice, as though saying it enough times might call the owner back into the room. Near the middle of that row lay a young man with bright red hair, and around him stood the whole of a large red-haired family, drawn in close. Fred Weasley was 19 years old, and he had spent most of those 19 years making other people laugh, and now he lay with the last of his own laughter, still half caught on his face. His twin brother George stood over him, and could not look away, and could not speak. Their mother had her hand pressed flat against Fred's chest, as if she could keep some warmth in him by sheer refusal to let go. Their father stood with both arms around as many of his children as he could reach. There is a particular kind of silence that comes off a family in that moment, and the whole hall seemed to lower its voice around it. A little way along lay 2 more of the fallen, set close to one another, because in life they had been close. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks had been married for barely a year. They had become parents only weeks before, to a small boy with a head of hair that changed its colour as easily as the sky changes light. Now they lay side by side, and the boy was not there to see it, because he was miles away, asleep in his grandmother's house, far too young to understand that the 2 people who had bent over his cot and argued gently about his name would not be coming home. He would grow up on stories of them. He would never carry a single memory of their faces that was truly his own. That was, in its way, one of the hardest things in that whole hard room, and it asked for no shouting at all. There were younger ones, too. A boy named Colin Creevey lay among them, small and slight, and looking even younger in stillness than he had in life. He had not even been old enough to fight. He had been turned away with the other underage students, sent off to safety down the secret passage, and he had crept back in, because he could not bear to be kept out of the one night that mattered most, and the war that did not care how brave he was had taken him anyway. Madame Pomfrey, the matron, moved among the wounded who still breathed, doing what she could, her face set and grey with tiredness. Healers had come up from St. Mungo's by then, the wizarding hospital in London, picking their way through the rubble of the entrance hall, and they worked without a word wasted, because there was so much to do, and so little of the night's strength left in anyone. Houses that had spent centuries keeping apart from one another sat mingled together on the floor of that hall, the green and the red and the yellow and the blue, all gone the same exhausted colour in the half-light. For one morning at least, none of the old divisions seemed worth a single breath, and through all of it, almost no one noticed that the one person the whole long war had turned around was no longer standing among them at all. Harry Potter had slipped out from under all those grateful eyes. He had spent the whole of the night being looked at, being the thing the fighting moved around, being the boy that everyone on both sides had decided the world would rise or fall upon. And when the killing finally stopped and the survivors turned to him with that bright, terrible hope on their faces, wanting to touch him, wanting to thank him, wanting him to tell them what it had all meant, he found that he could not stand under the weight of it for 1 minute longer. So he had reached into his robes and pulled out a cloak that had belonged to his father, and to his father's father before him, a cloak that made whoever wore it impossible to see, and he had drawn it over his head and gone looking for somewhere in that enormous broken castle where no one would ask him anything at all. Ron and Hermione found him anyway, or more truly, he let them find him. 10. Because after everything they had walked through together in the long months on the run, being unseen by the rest of the world was one thing, but being unseen by the two of them was something he discovered he did not actually want. The three of them went up through the castle side by side, the way they had walked side by side, through nearly everything since they were 11 years old. They were filthy and bloodied and burned at the edges. They were so tired that the stairs seemed to tilt under them. None of them had very much to say, and that was all right, because some kinds of tiredness are past the reach of words. On the way, Harry found that he was hungry. It was such a small, ordinary, living thing to feel that it almost made him want to laugh, in a way that was not far from crying. The house elves had been part of the fighting too, down in the kitchens and up through the lower floors, and one of them came to him now without being asked. Creature, the old elf of the house Harry had inherited, who had spent years bitter and broken and serving the wrong side, and who had ended the night charging in battle with a carving knife held high and the name of a long-dead master on his lips. Creature brought sandwiches, that was all. After a war that had swallowed so many lives, tired old elf brought a tired young man something to eat, because that was a thing that could be done, and in that moment it was as close to comfort as the castle had to offer. They climbed higher, up past the floors where the dust still hung in the air, until they came at last to a stone gargoyle that guarded a spiral stair, and they went up it, and they came into a round room high in one of the towers. This was the headmaster's office. The walls of that room were lined, all the way around and all the way up, with portraits of the witches and wizards who had run the school across the centuries, and the figures in those portraits were awake, and they were watching the door. When Harry stepped through it, every one of them rose to their feet, began to applaud. They beat their painted hands together and stamped their painted feet, and some of them called out, and some of them wept, and the noise of all those long-gone headmasters and headmistresses cheering for a boy of 17 filled the round room to the ceiling. Behind the great desk hung the newest portrait of them all, the painted figure of Albus Dumbledore, the old headmaster who had set so much of this in motion, and then died before he could see how it ended, sat in his frame with the tears running freely down into his long silver beard, and he was clapping harder than any of the rest. Harry had something to settle in that room, and he settled it before he let himself rest. In his hand he carried a wand that was not his own. It was a long, pale, knobbed thing, plain to look at, and it was the most dangerous object in the wizarding world. People had called it the Death Stick, and the Wand of Destiny, and a dozen other names across 1,000 years. That and the stories said that whoever truly mastered it could not be beaten in a duel. It had passed from murderer to murderer down the centuries, because the simplest way to take its loyalty was to kill the one who held it. Voldemort had wanted it more than he had wanted almost anything. He had broken open Dumbledore's tomb to take it, and in the end, through a tangle of choices and accidents that even Harry barely understood, the wand had never truly belonged to Voldemort at all. It had belonged to Harry. That was why Voldemort's last curse had turned back on him. The wand he was using would not strike down its own master. Harry had it now, and he could feel what it offered. Power without a ceiling, guarantee against ever losing again. He thought about it, and then he reached into his pocket and took out the broken halves of his own first wand, one of holly, with a single feather from a phoenix at its heart. The wand that had chosen him in a dusty little shop when he was 11, and had been snapped in two on the run that winter. He laid the pieces together. He touched the pale wand to the break. Warm gold light ran along the wood and sealed it, and the holly wand was whole again, alive again, his again. Then he made his choice about the dangerous one. He did not keep it. He had thought it through, as far as a boy that exhausted could think anything through, and he decided that he would return the elder wand to the tomb it had been stolen from, and lay it back beside the man who had earned it honestly. If the wand stayed with Harry, and Harry lived a long life, and died at last without ever being beaten, then its terrible power would die quietly with him, chain of murder and mastery broken at the end. That was the plan. No more death sticks, no more killers cutting their way up the line of owners. He would give it back to the grave, and hope the world forgot it had ever mattered. The third of the old objects, small black stone that could call the dead back as faint and sorrowful shadows, he had already let go. That. He had dropped it on the floor of the forest in the dark, on his way to die, and he had no intention of ever going to look for it, to let it stay lost among the leaves. The only one of the three he meant to keep was his father's cloak, the gentlest of them, the one that hid rather than harmed. With that done, there was nothing left to settle. Dumbledore's portrait spoke to him, low and warm, and told him he was a better man than the old headmaster had ever been, and Harry was too tired to argue. He left the dangerous wand where it could be dealt with properly later. And then, with Ron beside him, he walked down out of the tower, and across to the one place in that whole castle that had ever truly felt like home to him, the round common room high in another tower, with its worn red armchairs and its sagging four-poster beds. He lay down. He did not even take off his shoes. And Harry Potter, who had not had a full night's sleep in longer than he could remember, who had carried the whole of a war on his narrow shoulders since the age of 11, closed his eyes in a soft bed in a safe room, while the sun came up over the mountains, and he slept. He slept, while the castle below him began to count its losses and its survivors. He slept while owls carried the news out across the country, and witches and wizards in cottages and cities read it, and sat down hard wherever they happened to be standing. He slept through the whole of that first long day, and while he slept, without his doing anything at all, the first of 19 years began to turn. 19 years is a strange length of time. It is long enough for a baby to grow up and walk back through the same train station gate, that the grown-ups walked through that morning. It is long enough for grief to soften from a wound into a scar, and then into something you can almost carry without limping. It is long enough for the people who saved the world at 17 to become tired parents at 36, standing on a railway platform with luggage trolleys and worried children and a great deal of ordinary life packed around them. The story most people know stops at the moment Voldemort fell. It picks up again, 19 years later, on a bright September morning, with the next set of children boarding the train. What we are going to do tonight is walk slowly through the middle, the long, quiet, unfilmed years between the end of the war and that platform, the rebuilding, the trials, the funerals and the weddings, the babies who were named after the dead, the slow, stubborn, year-by-year work of putting a broken world back together while nobody outside was watching. So let us leave Harry sleeping in his tower and go out into the country he saved and see what those first days were like. The news travelled fast, the way it always does. Owls went out from Hogwarts before noon, and owls met other owls in the air, and by the afternoon the word had reached almost every wizarding home in Britain. He is gone. The Dark Lord is dead. Harry Potter has done it, and it is over. People did not know at first how to hold a thing like that. For more than a year, fear had been the water everyone swam in. Families had whispered behind locked doors. People had been afraid to say certain names aloud, afraid of who might be listening, afraid that a knock at the door in the small hours might be the last knock they ever answered. A whole government had been taken over from the inside and turned into a machine for hunting its own people. Children born to non-magical families had been dragged in front of councils and stripped of their wands and treated as thieves for the crime of being born with magic at all. That had been the world the morning before, and now, between one sunrise and the next, it was supposed to be over, and the human heart does not turn that quickly. Many people read the news and felt nothing at all for the first hour, a kind of numb, floating disbelief, before the truth came up through them and they wept, or laughed, or walked out into their gardens and stood looking up at an ordinary sky, hardly able to believe it was allowed to be ordinary again. In the streets where wizards and witches lived hidden among everyone else, the celebrations began, and some of them were not careful. There were shooting stars sent up in broad daylight that the non-magical neighbours puzzled over for weeks. There were owls flying about in the open, dozens at a time, until the morning papers in the ordinary world ran small confused articles about strange flocks of birds. The people whose job it was to keep magic a secret from the rest of the world, the obliviators and the misuse of Muggle artifacts office, suddenly had a great deal of cleaning up to do, going from town to town, smoothing over memories, explaining away the lights in the sky. It was the happiest emergency they had ever worked. But underneath the joy was a problem that joy could not solve. The country had no one steering it. Ministry of Magic, the government of Wizarding Britain, was a wreck. Not a wreck of broken stone, though there was some of that, but a wreck of trust. For nearly a year it had been run by Voldemort's people, with a puppet in the top chair and Terror doing the real governing. The man who had sat as minister had been little more than a prisoner under a curse, kept alive and propped up so that the public would not panic. Whole departments had been bent to evil work. The records were full of lies. Good people had been driven out or sent to prison or worse, and the corridors were full of officials who had gone along with all of it, some out of fear and some out of belief, and now stood about looking pale and wondering what would happen to them. You cannot simply unplug a government and plug in a new one. Somebody had to take hold of the thing in those first raw hours, before the relief curdled into chaos and people began settling their own scores in the streets. The man who took hold of it was named Kingsley Shacklebolt. He was an Auror, one of the dark wizard catchers, a tall, broad, calm-voiced man with a single gold earring and a way of speaking that made frightened people stop and listen. He had spent the last year of the war underground, hunted, working in secret to protect the helpless and to keep a thread of resistance alive. He was trusted, which, in those days, was the rarest currency there was. Trusted by the people who had fought and trusted by ordinary citizens who knew his name from the wireless broadcasts the resistance had run in the dark. And in the days right after the battle, the surviving leadership of the wizarding world turned to him almost without needing to discuss it and asked him to hold the ministry together until things could be done properly. He agreed. He was named the temporary minister for magic, and he walked into that wrecked and frightened building and began, hour by hour, to make it a place where people could breathe again. His first work was the simplest and the hardest. Stop the bleeding. Free the people who were still locked up for no crime. Call off the hunts that some of Voldemort's machinery was technically still running. Get word out, calmly and clearly, that the registration of Muggle-born witches and wizards was finished, that the councils were dissolved, that no one would be dragged from their home for the blood in their veins ever again. He sent honest people out to the prisons and the holding cells. He began the enormous task of finding out who had done what, who had been forced and who had chosen, who needed protecting and who needed catching, that. And he did it all while the celebrations were still going on in the streets above, while half the country was dancing and the other half was burying its dead. That was the shape of those first days. Joy and grief and exhaustion all braided together, and underneath them a quiet, steady man beginning the long work of governing a wounded people back towards something like peace. Harry slept through most of it. When he finally woke, hours and hours later, hungry again and aching in every joint, the world he woke into was already a little different from the one he had closed his eyes on. The terror was lifting. The work was beginning. And the first thing that work demanded, before the trials and the rebuilding and all the long years to come, was that the dead be carried gently to their rest. The funerals went on for the better part of a fortnight. There were too many of them to hold all at once, and grief, anyway, does not like to be hurried. So through the back half of that May, in churchyards, and on hillsides, and in the small private burial grounds that wizarding families had kept for generations, people of magical Britain laid their dead in the ground one by one, and stood in the soft spring air, and said goodbye. The hardest of them, for the people we have been following, was held at a crooked, leaning, much-loved house called the Burrow, where the Weasley family lived. Fred was buried near the home he had grown up in, within sight of the orchard, where he and George had spent half their childhood testing dangerous jokes on each other and on anyone foolish enough to come near. The whole family came, and so did half the people Fred had ever made laugh, which was a great many people, because making people laugh had been the central business of his short life. Told stories about him at the graveside. Somebody managed a joke, a real one, the kind Fred himself might have made, and there was a sound that was half laughter and half sobbing, and that sound was probably the truest thing said all day. George stood through it without speaking. He and Fred had been twins, identical down to the freckles, two halves of a single running joke that had lasted 19 years. They had finished each other's sentences since before they could properly talk. They had built a business together out of nothing but cleverness and nerve, a joke shop that had become the brightest, busiest, most ridiculous place in the whole of wizarding London. And now one of them was in the ground, and the other one was standing over it, and George Weasley had to learn, at 19, how to be a single person for the first time in his life. He did not get over it. People do not get over a thing like that. What he did, slowly, across the years we are going to walk through, was learn to carry it. But in that first week he mostly sat very still in rooms, and his mother watched him with the particular fear of a parent who has already lost one child and cannot bear the thought of losing the shape of another. Not far away, in those same weeks, 2 more graves were dug close together, because the 2 people going into them had loved each other and had so little time to do it in. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks were buried near one another. He had been a gentle, scholarly, much-suffering man, teacher, who had been one of the best Harry ever had, a werewolf who had spent his whole life being treated as something to be feared and had answered it by being kinder than almost anyone. She had been bright and clumsy and brave, young Aurora, who could change her appearance at will, and who used that gift, more often than not, to turn her nose into a pig's snout at the dinner table, just to make people laugh. They had married in the middle of the war, against a good deal of his own gloomy, protesting that he was too old and too poor and too dangerous for her. She had simply refused to listen, and she had been right to refuse. They had been happy. Briefly, fiercely, against every sensible objection, they had been happy, and they had made a child. The child's name was Teddy Lupin. He was not quite a month old when both his parents went to the castle to fight, and not quite a month old when neither of them came back. He had his mother's gift. His hair changed colour with his moods, turquoise when he was content, a startled pink when he was surprised, and on the day of the funerals it was, by all accounts, simply the soft brown of an ordinary sleeping baby, because he was far too small to know that there was anything in the world to grieve. He went to live with his grandmother. Her name was Andromeda Tonks, and of all the people left standing after the battle, she may have had the heaviest year of anyone. She had been born into one of the oldest and proudest pure-blood families in Britain, and she had walked away from all of it as a young woman because she had fallen in love with a muggle-born wizard named Ted, and her family had cut her off for it, struck her name from their family tree, refused ever to speak to her again. She had not minded. She had her Ted, and she had her daughter, and that had been enough for a whole life. Then the war came. During the months on the run, Ted had been caught by the wizard hunters who roamed the country looking for muggle-borns, and he had been killed. Andromeda lost her husband. A few months later, in a single night at the castle, she lost her only daughter and the son-in-law she had grown to love. And when the smoke cleared, this woman who had built her whole quiet happiness from scratch found herself standing in a house emptied of everyone, holding a grandson not yet 2 months old, with the whole work of raising him suddenly and entirely hers. She did it. She raised him. We will see Teddy grow up across these years into a cheerful, easy, popular boy with his mother's changing hair. It was Andromeda who made that possible, alone, out of her own grief, because the alternative was unthinkable to her, and so she simply did not allow it. She did not do it completely alone, though, because before he died, Lupin had asked Harry to be the boy's godfather, and Harry had said yes, and Harry took that yes seriously for the rest of his life. He was barely an adult himself, with no idea how to be anybody's godfather, with his own grief and his own ruined nerves to manage. But he came to that house. He kept coming. As the years turned, Teddy Lupin became a fixed and beloved part of Harry's world, in and out of his home, underfoot at his table, the older boy that Harry's own children would one day adore. The orphan was not left to grow up unloved. That mattered. In a story with this much sorrow folded into it, that one thread of kept promises is worth holding on to as you fall asleep, and those were only 3 of the 50. There were so many others. There was the small Creevy boy, buried by a muggle family who had never fully understood the world their bright, camera-loving son had been so desperate to belong to, and who buried him not understanding how he had died, only that he was gone. That. There were students barely out of childhood and grown witches and wizards who had answered the call to defend the school, house elves, centaur or 2 from the forest, people whose names never made the front pages and who were mourned all the same by the handful of people who had loved them. Hogwarts itself would in time find ways to remember them, but in those first weeks there was no monument and no ceremony grand enough. There was only the plain, repeated, human work of digging and standing and weeping and going home, over and over, until the dead were all in the ground and the living were left to work out how to go on living. That is the part the stories usually skip. The morning after the great victory is not a parade. It is a fortnight of funerals, and the people we think of as heroes spent those weeks the same way everyone does, in churchyards and on hillsides, with red eyes and black robes, learning the names of their own losses by heart. When the last grave was filled and the last family had gone home, the country lifted its head, dried its face, and turned to a question that could not be put off any longer. The dead were buried. The terror was over. But the people who had caused it, the ones who had done the hunting and the killing and the torturing, most of them were still alive, and many of them were still free. Something had to be done about that. And so, as the spring of 1998 turned towards summer, Wizarding Britain began the long, grim, necessary business of justice. Justice, after a war like that one, is a tangled thing. It is never as clean as anyone wants it to be. Some of the people who had served Voldemort were dead already, fallen in the castle alongside the people they had been trying to kill. Some had been captured during the fighting and were already sitting in, holding cells by the time the sun came up. But a great many had not. When the battle turned and it became plain that the Dark Lord was losing, a good number of his followers had done what such people generally do. They ran. They scattered into the countryside, or fled abroad, or went home and bolted the doors, and began, frantically, to invent stories about how they had never really meant any of it, how they had been forced, how they had secretly been on the right side all along. So the first long task of the new ministry, once the immediate danger had passed, was to find them. The Aurors led it. Harry's friends and future colleagues among the dark wizard catchers spent the months after the battle doing the unglamorous, dangerous, painstaking work of tracking down everyone who had a real crime to answer for. Not only the masked Death Eaters in their inner circle, but the Snatchers too, the freelance hunters who had roamed the country during the bad year, dragging muggle-borns and blood traitors to the authorities for a reward. There had been a lot of those. Cowards mostly, kind of men who only find their courage when their victim is unarmed and outnumbered, and who melt away the instant the wind changes. They were rounded up through the summer and the autumn, one by one, pulled out of hiding places and quiet foreign towns, and the spare bedrooms of relatives who had thought better of sheltering them. And then they were tried. The Wizengamot, the High Court of Magical Britain, sat for months. These were not the show trials of the year before, where Muggle-borns had been condemned in advance by a panel that only wanted an excuse. Kingsley was determined that the new courts would be the opposite of the old ones, that they would be fair even to people who had shown no fairness to anyone, because a justice that throws away its own rules the moment it is angry is not justice, and he had just watched where that road led. So there were proper hearings, there was evidence. People who had been wronged were allowed to stand up and say what had been done to them. And the guilty, when they were found guilty, were sentenced according to what they had actually done, rather than according to how frightened or how furious the part happened to be. One of those trials, in particular, gave a great many people a grim sort of satisfaction. Dolores Umbridge had never worn a Death Eater's mask. She had never, as far as anyone could prove, cast a killing curse with her own pink-gloved hand. That was part of what made her so dangerous. She had done her evil with paperwork. During the bad year, when the ministry had been turned into a machine for hunting Muggle-borns, it had been Umbridge who ran the worst of it, sitting in judgment over terrified men and women, deciding who got to keep their wand and their freedom, and who did not, all while wearing a sweet smile and surrounding herself with kittens on decorative plates. She had hidden behind the law the whole time, insisting that she was only doing her job, only following the rules, only carrying out policy. When the war ended, she discovered that the law she had hidden behind had teeth of its own, that she was put on trial for what she had done to the Muggle-born witches and wizards who had come before her commission, and she was found guilty, and she was sent to prison. There was no smile that could argue its way out of that. A great many people who had suffered under her slept a little easier knowing where she had gone. Not every story of those trials was so straightforward, though. Some of them were complicated in ways that did not feel like victory at all. The clearest example was a family by the name of Malfoy. The Malfoys had been on the wrong side for the whole of the war, and for a long time before it. Lucius Malfoy, the father, had been one of Voldemort's followers since the First War, decades earlier, proud and wealthy pure blood, who had genuinely believed in the cause when it was winning, and had clung to the edges of it out of fear once it began to turn. By the end, the family had fallen far. Their grand house had been taken over as Voldemort's headquarters. Their fortune and their standing had crumbled. And on the last night, when the fighting reached its height, something had shifted in them, because the truth was that Lucius and his wife and their teenage son no longer cared about pure blood purity or the Dark Lord's triumph at all, cared about one thing. They wanted to find their boy, Draco, and get him out alive. It was Narcissa Malfoy, the mother, who made the choice that saved her whole family from prison. At the very end, deep in the forest, Voldemort had struck Harry down and believed he had killed him, and he sent Narcissa to check the body to confirm to the waiting crowd that the boy who lived was finally dead. She bent over Harry in the dark. She felt his heart still beating, and she understood in that instant that he was alive. She also understood that the only way she would ever be allowed back into the castle to search for her own son was if the fighting continued, which meant the only way to reach Draco was to lie to the most dangerous wizard alive, to his face, with her own life as the stake. So she lied. She stood up and told Voldemort that Harry Potter was dead. It was that lie, more than almost anything else, that let the final battle happen at all and gave the defenders their chance. A mother looking for her son did more damage to Voldemort in one whispered sentence than most of his enemies managed with a wand. When it came time for justice, that was remembered. Harry himself spoke for them. He told the court what Narcissa had done and how the family had stood apart at the end, fighting for no one but each other. The Malfoys were not innocent, and nobody pretended they were that. But they were not sent to Azkaban. They were allowed to go home, disgraced, their name a byword for everything that had failed, their influence broken, their proud old standing gone for good. For a family that had spent generations measuring its worth in power and bloodline, being left alive and poor in reputation, scorned in the very circles they had once ruled, was its own kind of long sentence. Draco would go on to live a careful, withdrawn sort of life, marry quietly, raise a son of his own, and try, in his guarded way, to be something better than his father had been. That story is not finished yet, and we will return to it. There was one more piece of that early reckoning that mattered for everything to come, and it concerned the prison itself. Azkaban, the great fortress in the cold northern sea, where Wizarding Britain kept its worst criminals, had been guarded for centuries by creatures called Dementors. They were among the foulest things in the magical world, hooded and faceless, and they fed on human happiness, draining every good feeling out of anyone who came near until all that was left was despair. Locking a person in a cell surrounded by Dementors was a punishment beyond what most courts in the ordinary world would ever dream of. Prisoners did not simply lose their freedom. They lost their minds, slowly, in the dark. And the deepest problem with the arrangement, the one Kingsley understood and acted on, was that creatures who feed on misery have no loyalty to anyone. The Dementors had served the Ministry only so long as the Ministry kept them fed. The moment Voldemort offered them more victims and more freedom, they had gone over to him without a backward glance, and they had done terrible work in his name. Kingsley refused to keep relying on them. As one of the early acts of his ministry, he ordered the Dementors removed from Azkaban altogether. The prison would still hold its prisoners, but it would be guarded by trained witches and wizards, by auras and human warders, rather than by soulless things that could be bought by the next dark wizard to come along with a better offer. It was a reform that said something about the whole spirit of the new government. The old way had been to keep order through terror, to fight darkness with a darkness of its own, and Kingsley had decided that the country was done with that. It was a small headline at the time, buried under the bigger news of the trials. In the long run, it was one of the truest signs that the war had genuinely ended, and that something gentler had taken its place. By the time the leaves turned and the first autumn after the war came on, the worst of the guilty were in prison, the innocent were free, and the courts were beginning to empty. The reckoning was not perfect. No reckoning ever is. But it was honest, and it was finished without becoming the very thing it was meant to punish. And with the living judged and the dead buried, the wizarding world could finally turn toward the one piece of unfinished business that touched almost everyone, and that asked not for justice or for grief, but for repair. It was time to think about the school. Before we get to the school itself, there is a debt that has to be paid, because the truth of it had been buried under the rubble along with everything else, and Harry was one of the only people alive who could dig it out. Concerned, a man almost everyone had spent the war hating. Severus Snape had died on the last night, in a dirty little building at the edge of the school grounds, killed on Voldemort's orders by the great snake he kept at his side. He had died believing himself a failure, hated by the very people he had spent years trying to protect, suspected by both sides, loved by no one. To the whole of the wizarding world, Snape was the worst kind of traitor. He had murdered Albus Dumbledore on the tower at the end of Harry's 6th year in front of witnesses. He had then taken over Hogwarts as Voldemort's headmaster, ruling the school through a year of fear. Children had learned to be terrified of him. His name, by the end, was a name people spat. If you had asked anyone in Britain that spring who the cruelest, most cold-blooded villain of the whole war had been, after Voldemort himself, a great many of them would have said Severus Snape. Almost all of it was a lie. Not a lie, Snape told. A lie he lived on purpose for 16 years, knowing that it would cost him every shred of his reputation, and most likely his life, because the lie was the only thing keeping a thread of hope alive inside Voldemort's own ranks. As he lay dying, Snape had done one last thing. He had pulled the memories out of his own mind, silver and shining, and pressed them on Harry, the boy he had spent years pretending to despise. And Harry had taken those memories to the great stone basin in the headmaster's office, and poured himself into them, and watched, and finally understood the man he had hated for so long. He learned that Snape had loved Harry's mother, Lily, since they children together, long before either of them came to Hogwarts. He learned that the two of them had been friends, close friends, and that Snape's own choices had pushed her away and toward the boy who would become Harry's father, a wound that never healed in him. He learned that when Voldemort had set out to murder the Potters, it was Snape, in an agony of guilt and terror, who had gone to Dumbledore and begged him to protect Lily, and had been told that to earn that protection he would have to turn against everything he had become and spend the rest of his life as a spy in the most dangerous place in the world. And he had done it. After Lily died anyway, Snape had kept doing it year after year, not for any reward, because there was none, but because protecting the son of the woman he had loved was the only thing left that gave his life a shape. The murder on the tower had not been a murder at all in the way it looked. Dumbledore had been dying already, slain by a curse he had brought on himself months earlier, with only a year or so left to live. He had asked Snape to be the one to end it, to spare him a worse death, and to save a frightened boy from becoming a killer, and to plant Snape that much more deeply in Voldemort's trust. Snape had not wanted to do it. He had done it because Dumbledore asked, and because the cause needed it, and he had carried the look on Dumbledore's face into the rest of his short life. The year he spent running Hogwarts as Voldemort's man, the year the students remembered as a reign of terror, had in truth been a year of Snape doing everything he secretly could to shield those same students from the genuine monsters Voldemort had installed beneath him. taking the blame, drawing the fire, protecting children who would grow up, hating his memory, and never know that he had stood between them and something far worse. Harry came out of those memories a changed person, and he carried the truth out of the war with him. He was, very possibly, the only one who could have made the world believe it, because he was the one person the world was prepared to trust above all others, and he had no reason left to lie about a man he had spent his whole life resenting. So he told the truth. He told it at the trials when it was relevant, and he told it plainly afterward, and he made sure the record showed what Severus Snape had actually been. Not a gentleman, not a kind one. Snape had been bitter and harsh and unfair, and Harry never pretended otherwise. But he had been, in the way that counts most, one of the bravest men who ever lived, and he had given everything he had in secret, with no thanks coming and none expected, to a side that despised him. It took time for the world to swallow it. People do not enjoy being told that the villain they were so sure of was something else underneath, and there were those who never fully forgave or believed. But the truth took hold, slowly, the way truth does. Severus Snape's name was lifted out of the dirt where it had been thrown. In time, his portrait came to hang in the headmaster's office at Hogwarts, among the others who had run the school. That was not automatic. By the old custom, a headmaster who had abandoned his post did not earn a place on that wall, and Snape had vanished from the school on the last night rather than die in the chair. It was Harry who saw to it that the portrait went up anyway, who argued that the man had earned his place 100 times over, in the only way that mattered. And so the painted figure of Severus Snape took its place high on that round wall, beside Dumbledore, beside all the rest, watching over the school he had quietly protected at the cost of his good name. Years later, when Harry had a son of his own with black hair and his mother's green eyes, he would give that boy 2 names from the war. One was Albus, after the old headmaster. The other was Severus. And when the boy grew old enough to be frightened of the name he carried, Harry would crouch down and tell him that he had been named for 2 headmasters of Hogwarts, and that one of them had been a Slytherin and was probably the bravest man Harry had ever known. That is how thoroughly the truth had turned. The name that had been a curse became a name a father gave his son out of respect. Snape was the largest of the names set right after the war, but he was not the only one. The ministry under Kingsley went back through the wreckage of the old regime's records and began undoing the injustices it found there. People who had been imprisoned for crimes they did not commit, swept up in the panic and the malice of the bad year, were freed and cleared. A nervous young man named Stan Shunpike, who had worked as a conductor on the wizarding bus and had been locked away on flimsy suspicion with hardly any evidence at all, was one of those let go. The hunted Muggleborns had their records wiped clean of the lies that had been written about them, and the memory of Sirius Black, Harry's godfather, who had spent 12 years in Azkaban for a betrayal he never committed and had died still branded a criminal in the public mind, could finally be set straight, the true traitor having long since met his own end. The dead could not be brought back by a corrected record, but there is a kind of peace in a name being cleaned, even after its owner is gone, and the new ministry understood that part of healing a country is telling the truth about who its people had really been. With the dead buried, the guilty judged, and the wronged restored, the wizarding world had done nearly all the grim, backward-looking work that the end of a war demands. What remained was the part that looked forward. There was a castle in the mountains, the oldest and most beloved building in magical Britain, and it was half in ruins. Rebuilding it would be, in a way, the rebuilding of everything, and so we turn now to Hogwarts, and to the woman who took up the enormous task of making it whole again. The castle was a wreck, and everyone loved it, which is exactly why rebuilding it mattered so much. Hogwarts had stood in those mountains for 1,000 years. It had weathered everything time could throw at a building, and it had grown stranger and more beloved with every century. All its shifting staircases, and hidden passages, and rooms that were not always there when you went looking for them. To the people of magical Britain, it was not only a school, it was the place most of them had become themselves. It was where they had made their first friends, learned their first spells, had their first heartbreaks, found out what they were good at and what they were afraid of. Nearly every adult in the country had walked those halls as a child. So when the last night of the war left whole sections of it blown apart, towers cracked, walls fallen in, the courtyards strewn with rubble and worse, the wound was not only to a building, it was to the shared childhood of an entire people. Putting it back together became the work of that summer, and it became something more than repair. It became the way the wizarding world told itself that life was going to go on. The person who led it was Minerva McGonagall. She had been at Hogwarts longer than almost anyone, first as the head of Gryffindor House and the teacher of Transfiguration, the stern, sharp, fiercely fair witch in the square spectacles whom generations of students had feared, and underneath the fear, trusted completely. She had stood at the heart of the resistance inside the school during the bad year. She had fought in the final battle, dueling at the front of the castle's defenders, an elderly woman throwing herself against the worst the enemy could send. That, when the new term needed a head, there was no real question who it would be. Minerva McGonagall became the headmistress of Hogwarts, and she would hold that post for many years, steering the school through the whole stretch of time we are walking across tonight. That actual rebuilding was done with magic, of course, and it was an extraordinary thing to watch by the accounts of those who were there. Witches and wizards came from all over the country to help, skilled and unskilled, professionals and ordinary people who simply could not bear to sit at home while the school stood broken. Stones lifted themselves back into walls, staircases reassembled out of scattered steps. Hagrid, the half-giant gamekeeper, who loved the castle and its grounds with a fierce, simple devotion, worked through the long summer days, hauling and lifting and mending, his enormous strength turned for once to gentle ends. There were teachers and parents, and former students all working side by side. There were arguments about how a particular corridor had really looked, because the castle had so many quirks that no single person held the whole picture of it, and old graduates would turn up swearing that a certain gargoyle had faced the other way, or that there had been one more window in the charms corridor than the builders were putting back. And slowly, across those weeks, Castle came whole again. It was not identical to what it had been. A building that old never goes back to exactly its old shape, and there were scars left in places on purpose, marks kept as a kind of remembering. But by the end of the summer, Hogwarts stood again on its rock above the lake, its towers reaching up into the Highland sky, its windows lit, its halls swept and ready. The owls were back in the owlery. The portraits were back on the walls, gossiping among themselves. The ghosts drifted the corridors as they always had. From the outside, if you did not know what it had been through, you would have thought nothing had ever happened there at all. The most important day was the 1st of September. That is the day, every year, when the great scarlet steam train pulls out the hidden platform in a London station and carries the students north to begin a new term. For most of a year, the war had poisoned even that. The bad year's term had been one of fear and fascist cruelty. Attendance made compulsory under the new regime. Muggle-borns barred. The whole school turned into a place of dread. So, when the 1st of September came around again, that first peacetime autumn, and the train ran north full of children for an ordinary new year, with parents waving from the platform, and trunks being heaved aboard, and the smoke billowing up under the station roof, carried a weight far beyond a normal term beginning. It was proof. The school had survived. The children were coming back. The 1,000-year-old rhythm had taken up again, as if to say that even the worst year in living memory had not been able to break it for good. That among those who came back that September was a particular kind of returning student, and Hermione Granger was one of them. The war had thrown a whole age group's education into chaos. There were young people who had been due to sit their final exams, the all-important tests that decided what doors would open in adult life, and who had instead spent that year on the run, or in hiding or fighting, and had never sat them. McGonagall opened the doors of the school to all of them. Anyone whose education had been broken by the war was welcome to come back and finish it properly, to repeat the lost year and take their exams in peace. Many did. They became known, half fondly, as the 8th years, a little older than the rest, marked by what they had been through, sharing common rooms with children who had spent the war safely at home, and who looked at these scarred returnees with a kind of awe. Hermione went back. Of the 3 friends at the centre of this whole story, she was the one who returned to Hogwarts to finish what the war had interrupted. It was entirely in keeping with who she was. She had always been the one who loved the learning for its own sake, who read ahead, who could not stand to leave a thing half done. She had spent a year proving she could survive anything, and she chose, when it was over, to go back to a classroom and sit her exams, because some part of her needed the world to be a place where finishing your education still mattered. She took her final year. She sat her tests. She passed them, of course, with the kind of results that made even the examiners pause. And she came out the other side ready for the working life that would, in the end, carry her further than almost anyone of her generation. Harry and Ron did not go back with her. They had been offered something else, and it pulled them in a different direction. And the splitting of their 3 paths in that first autumn is where the long middle of this story really opens out. That, for 7 years the 3 of them had moved through the world together, more or less as one. Now, with the war won, and adulthood arriving all at once, their lives began to fan apart into 3 separate shapes, the way lives do. They would stay bound to one another for the rest of their days, by love and by marriage, and by the simple unbreakable fact of what they had survived together. But they would no longer wake up in the same place and walk to the same lessons. They were becoming at last 3 grown people with 3 grown lives. And to understand the years ahead, we need to follow each of those lives in turn, starting with the 2 who walked away from the school that autumn and into the most dangerous job the ministry had to offer. The offer came from Kingsley himself, and it was the kind of offer that does not get made twice. The Auror office was the elite of the ministry, core of highly trained witches and wizards who hunted dark wizards for a living. Becoming an Auror normally took years. You needed top marks in your final school exams, a string of demanding subjects passed at the highest level, and then a further 3 years of brutal training after that, with most applicants washing out along the way. It was, by design, one of the hardest careers in the magical world to enter. Harry and Ron had none of the qualifications. They had never sat their final exams at all. That, by the ordinary rules, they should not even have been allowed to apply. Kingsley waved the rules aside, and almost no one objected. The 2 of them had spent the last year of the war doing, in the field, under fire, with their lives on the line, exactly the work that Auror training was meant to prepare a person for. They had tracked the most dangerous wizard alive across an entire country. They had broken into the most secure building in Britain and into the most secure bank in the world. They had fought and survived and won. There was nothing a training program could teach them about facing dark magic that they had not already learned the hardest possible way. So the new minister offered Harry and Ron places in the Auror office directly, on the strength of what they had done, and they took them. That autumn, while Hermione went north to school, the 2 young men reported to the Ministry of Magic in London and began their working lives as dark wizard catchers. There was plenty of work waiting for them, because the war did not end as cleanly as a single fallen body might suggest. Voldemort was dead, but the world he had poisoned did not heal overnight. There were still Death Eaters at large in those first years, the ones who had slipped the net, hiding abroad or going to ground at home. some of them clinging to the old cause and dreaming of revenge, others simply trying to disappear. There were lesser dark wizards who saw the chaos after a great war as an opportunity, the way criminals always do when the old order has been shaken. There were dangerous objects scattered about, cursed artifacts left over from the conflict, hidden caches of dark magic that had to be tracked down before they fell into the wrong hands. The Auror office of those years was busy in a way it had rarely been in peacetime, cleaning up the long tail of a war that had officially ended, hunting down the last of the people who had made it so terrible. Harry was very good at it. That will surprise no one. He had a kind of instinct for the work that could not be taught, a willingness to walk toward danger that came not from recklessness but from having already faced the worst thing there was and survived it. He rose quickly. By his late 20s, less than a decade after that first day, Harry Potter was the head of the Auror office, the youngest person in living memory to hold the post, running the entire dark wizard-catching corps of magical Britain. Under him, the department changed. He had seen up close what a ministry looked like when it abandoned its principles, when it hunted the innocent and tortured prisoners and called it order. He had no intention of letting the Auror office become anything like that. He built it into something cleaner and fairer than it had been, a force that protected people without becoming a thing to be feared in its own right, and he spent his working years making sure the corruption that had let Voldemort take over from the inside could never take root again so easily. It was steady, unglamorous, genuinely good work. The work of a man who had decided that the way you win the peace is by being, every single day, the opposite of what you fought against. Ron worked beside him for the first stretch of it, and Ron was good at the job too, braver than he ever gave himself credit for, and quick under pressure in ways that years of standing at Harry's shoulder had sharpened. But the Auror life was not, in the end, the life Ron wanted, and there was somewhere else he was needed more. His brother George was running the family joke shop alone, and running it alone was hollowing him out. After a couple of years catching dark wizards, Ron made a choice that said a great deal about the kind of man he had grown into. He left the most prestigious job in the ministry, the job thousands of young wizards would have given anything for, and he went to work behind the counter of a shop that sold trick wands and exploding sweets, because his grieving brother could not bear to do it by himself. Weasley's wizarding wheezes had been built by two brothers, and one of those brothers was gone, and Ron stepped into the empty place. He was not Fred, and he never tried to be, and George never asked him to be, but he was family, and he was there, and the two of them turned out to make a good team in their own right. The shop did not just survive, it thrived, came. Across these years, one of the great successes of wizarding commerce, a bright, loud, joyful place in the middle of magical London that drew children and adults alike, and it made the Weasley family, who had been poor for the whole of Ron's childhood, genuinely and comfortably wealthy at last. There is a particular sweetness in that the boy who had grown up in hand-me-down robes, ashamed of how little his family had, helped build the thing that finally lifted them out of it, and he did it by standing beside his broken brother and refusing to let the laughter die with Fred. And then there was Hermione, whose path was the longest climb of the three, and in the end the highest. She came out of her final year at Hogwarts with the qualifications to do almost anything, and she chose, characteristically, the unfashionable thing. She joined the ministry, but not in one of the glamorous departments. She went to work in the department for the regulation and control of magical creatures because she had spent her school years caring, sometimes to the exasperation of everyone around her, about the way the magical world treated the beings it considered beneath it. She had campaigned as a teenager for the rights of house elves, the small enslaved beings who served wizarding households, and had been taught to believe they deserved nothing better. Most people had found her crusade faintly ridiculous. She had not cared then, and she did not care now. From inside the ministry, with real authority behind her at last, she set about the slow, grinding, deeply unglamorous work of actually changing things. She worked to improve the conditions of house elves, and to chip away at the old pure-blood laws that had kept so many magical beings treated as property or vermin. It was the kind of work that wins no headlines and earns plenty of enemies, patient rewriting of cruel rules one clause at a time, and she had exactly the temperament for it, relentless, brilliant, impossible to wear down. In time she moved across to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the most powerful department in the whole ministry, the one that oversaw the courts and the auras and the keeping of order. She rose there too, steadily, on nothing but ability, until she ran it. Further down the years, beyond the edge of where most people's knowledge of this story stops, Hermione Granger would climb higher still, to the very top, to the office Kingsley had once held in that first wrecked autumn. But that is a long way off yet, Ted, and there is a great deal of living to do before we get there. So the three friends were launched, each onto a different current, one of them building peace from inside the law, one of them building joy from behind a shop counter, one of them protecting the country with a wand. They had walked out of childhood and the war together, and now they were three separate adults with three separate lives. But the bonds between them were not loosening. If anything, in those same years, two of those bonds were tightening into something permanent, because while their careers were taking shape, so was the rest of their lives. And the next great thread of this story is not about work at all. It is about love and marriage and the slow building of new families on the ground that the war had cleared. The first peacetime years had a texture all their own, and it took the survivors a while to learn how to live in it. When you have spent your formative years braced for the worst, peace does not feel, at first, like relief. It feels like waiting for the other shoe to drop. People who had spent a year flinching at every knock found that the flinch did not leave them just because the danger had. Harry himself slept badly for a long time and woke from dreams he did not talk about and had to teach his body, slowly, that the running was over. That is one of the things the stories never show you about the ones who win. The winning does not undo what the fighting wrote into them. They carry it home and live alongside it, and the great achievement of those early years was not any single grand act. It was the smaller, harder work of learning to be calm again. What helped, more than anything, was being folded into a family. Harry had grown up with no family worth the name, raised by an aunt and uncle who treated him as an unwanted burden, sleeping for years in a cupboard under the stairs, never once told that he was loved. The war had taken from him the parents he could not remember, and the godfather he had only just found. That, by rights, he might have come out of all of it alone. He did not, because somewhere along the way the Weasleys had simply decided that he was one of theirs, and after the war they made it permanent in every way that was not paperwork. He spent long stretches at the Burrow, that crooked, warm, overstuffed house, with its clock that showed where each family member was, and its garden full of gnomes and its kitchen that always smelled of something cooking. Mrs. Weasley fed him as though she were trying to make up for 17 years of neglect all at once, which in a sense she was. He had a place at that table. After a childhood of being barely tolerated, having a place at a noisy, loving table was its own quiet miracle, and he never stopped knowing it. And there was Ginny. Harry and Ginny Weasley had found each other during his 6th year, in a brief and happy stretch before everything fell apart. And then Harry had ended it himself, deliberately, because he could see what was coming, and he could not bear the thought of Voldemort using her to get to him. It had been one of the bravest and most miserable things he had ever done, walking away from the one good thing. He had to keep her safe. She had not argued much. She had understood the way she understood most things, with a clear, unsentimental sharpness that was one of the reasons he loved her. She had spent the war fighting in her own right, leading resistance inside the school, never the damsel anyone needed to rescue. And when it was over, The two of them came back together without much in the way of grand speeches, because the thing between them had never really stopped. It had only been set down for a while, the way you set down something precious before a fight, so it will not get broken, and now they picked it up again. What grew between them across those years was the real thing, durable and unshowy. She was funny and fierce and entirely unafraid of him, which mattered because half the world treated Harry Potter like a monument, and Ginny treated him like a person who needed teasing when he got too solemn. They were well matched. They had both been through the fire. Neither of them needed the other to pretend the past had not happened. In the rebuilt world, while Harry climbed his way up through the Auror office, his relationship with Ginny deepened from the bright young thing it had been into something settled and sure, and everyone who knew them could see where it was heading, long before either of them said the word, that. The other great romance of this story had begun in the most unlikely place imaginable, in the middle of the final battle, with the castle coming down around them. Ron and Hermione had been circling each other for years, since they were children, in the maddening, oblivious way that children do, bickering and sulking, and refusing to admit there was anything to admit. The whole of their friendship had been laced through with a tension that everyone around them could see, and that the two of them seemed determined to ignore. It had survived jealousy and stupidity, and one genuinely painful stretch during the war when Ron, worn down and frightened, had walked away from the hunt for a time before fighting his way back. And it had come to its point, finally, on the worst night of all of their lives. In the thick of the fighting, in a moment of sudden fear for the lives of the house elves, Hermione had thrown her arms around Ron and kissed him. And Ron, after years of waiting without knowing he was waiting, had kissed her back, and even Harry, in the middle of the most desperate hour of the war, had found a half-second to think that it was about time. After the war, what had started in fire settled into something warm and lasting. They were not an easy couple. They argued. They were too different in too many ways. She relentless and precise, and a little impatient. He easygoing and loyal, and prone to saying the wrong thing. But the differences fit together rather than grinding against each other, and underneath the bickering was a bond that had been tested by literal life and death, and had held. They built a life. He worked beside his brother at the shop, and she climbed through the ministry, and at the end of each day they came home to each other, and the friendship that had been the spine of the whole long adventure became the foundation of an ordinary, happy, grown-up marriage. Two couples, then, growing toward two weddings on the cleared ground that the war had left behind. It is worth slowing down on those weddings, because in a story so full of funerals, the days when these particular people stood up in front of everyone they loved and chose joy on purpose are days that deserve to be lingered over. So let us go to the first of them, on a summer afternoon a few years after the war, when Harry Potter, who had spent his whole life being defined by death, stood at the front of a gathering and got to be defined, for once, by love. The wedding of Harry and Ginny was, by every account, a smaller and gentler affair than the size of Harry's fame might have led anyone to expect. Then he could have had a spectacle. He was the most famous wizard alive, and there were plenty of people who would have turned his wedding into a public event with crowds and photographers and the whole watching country leaning in. He wanted none of it. What he wanted, after a lifetime of being looked at, was a day among the people who actually knew him, in a place that meant something, with no strangers pressing their faces against the glass. So they were married close to the burrow, in the same kind of soft summer weather, with a white marquee in a field and fairy lights strung through the trees as the afternoon wore toward evening. The Weasleys filled most of the seats, because the Weasleys were by then very nearly Harry's whole family. Hermione was there, of course, and the friends from school who had survived, Neville and Luna and the others, grown now and scattered into their own lives, but pulled back together for the day. There were empty chairs that everyone felt without naming, Fred was not there. Lupin and Tonks were not there. Sirius was not there, nor were Harry's own parents, who had died when he was a baby and who would have given anything to see this day. A wedding for people who have lived through a war is always a little haunted. The joy of it shot through with the ache of all the faces that should have been in the crowd and were not. But the haunting did not spoil it. If anything, it sharpened the gladness. The way the memory of winter makes a warm day taste better. People who were there had earned the right to be happy, and they took it. Ginny, by then, was becoming a star in her own right, not because she had married one. She was an exceptional flyer. She had been one of the best players on the school team, fast and fearless and ruthless in the air. And after she left school, she did something Harry never could have done, which was to step out from under the shadow of the war and build a life around pure joy and competition. She joined the Holyhead Harpies, the famous all-witch professional Quidditch team, one of the oldest and most respected clubs in the league, and she played for them at the top level of the sport. For several years, while Harry chased dark wizards through the back streets of magical Britain, Ginny chased golden balls across packed stadiums, cheered by tens of thousands of fans who knew her name for her own sake. There is something fitting about that. The girl who had spent the war being told, by her own protective family, to stay out of the danger, grew into a woman who flew professionally in front of roaring crowds, fearless and celebrated, defined entirely by what she could do rather than who she had nearly lost. She did not play forever. When she and Harry began to think about children, she stepped back from the professional game. But she did not step back from the sport. She turned her sharp eye and her sharper tongue to writing, and she became the senior Quidditch correspondent for the Daily Prophet, the main newspaper of Wizarding Britain. It was a perfect second act for her. She knew the game from the inside. She feared no player and no manager, and she wrote about the sport with a wit that made her column one of the most read in the paper. Across the years we are walking through, if you opened the Prophet to the sports pages, most respected voice you would find, there was Ginny Potter's, and the readers who loved her writing were a separate set of people from the ones who knew her only as the wife of the famous Auror. She had made her own name twice over, once on a broom and once with a quill, and that independence was part of what made the marriage work. They were two people who each had a world of their own, meeting in the middle to build a third world together. That third world had a home, and the home mattered too. Harry had inherited a house during the war, a tall, dark, grim old townhouse in London that had belonged to Sirius's family, the ancient and unpleasant House of Black. It had been the headquarters of the resistance for a time, full of dust and dark objects, and the screaming portrait of Sirius's dreadful mother bolted to the hallway wall. It was not, on the face of it, a happy place to start a family. But Harry had loved Sirius, and the house was one of the last links he had to him, and so, rather than abandon it, he and Ginny set about making it livable. Across the early years of the marriage they cleaned it out, room by room, banishing the worst of its darkness, taming the portrait, throwing open the curtains that had been shut for decades, turned a house that had been a monument to one of the cruelest pure-blood families in Britain into a warm and ordinary home where children would grow up loved. There is a kind of victory in that too, the slow domestic kind that never makes a headline. The boy who had slept in a cupboard made a real home out of a house of horrors and filled it, in time, with the laughter of his own children. For now, though, the children were still ahead of them. In those first married years, it was just the two of them. Harry coming home from the ministry tired and often troubled, Ginny coming in from training or from the newspaper office, the two of them building the small private routines that are the actual substance of a marriage, and that no biography ever bothers to record. Who made the tea? Which one of them was hopeless in the mornings? The arguments that meant nothing, and the silences that meant everything. The ordinary, unspectacular, irreplaceable business of two people choosing each other, day after day, in peacetime. It was the life Harry had never dared to picture for himself, because for most of his life there had been no reason to believe he would live long enough to have it, and now he did have it, and he knew exactly what it was worth, which is a thing that can only really be known by someone who once expected to die young. He did not take a single quiet morning for granted. That is perhaps the deepest mark the war left on him, deeper than the bad dreams. He had learned the hardest way there is, that an ordinary happy life is not a small thing at all, and he spent the rest of his years treating his as the treasure it was, that. While Harry and Ginny were settling into their married life, the second of our two great couples was approaching their own wedding, and theirs would be a louder, funnier, more chaotic affair, exactly as anyone who knew Ron and Hermione would have predicted. So let us turn to them. That Ron and Hermione's wedding was held not long after, and it had a different flavour entirely, 'cause they were different people, and they were marrying into the full uproar of the Weasley clan, with none of Harry's instinct for keeping things small. Hermione had no large family of her own in the wizarding world. Her parents were dentists, muggles, kind and bewildered people who had raised a daughter that turned out to be one of the most gifted witches of her age, and who had spent years trying to understand a world they could not enter. During the war, to keep them safe, Hermione had done something that cost her more than she ever fully said. She had altered her own parents' memories, wiped herself out of their minds entirely, given them new names and new desires, and sent them off to the other side of the world, believing they had no daughter at all. After the war, she went to find them and tried to put right what she had done. The truth is that not all of it could be put right. Memory magic is delicate and dangerous, and a thing like that leaves marks. But she did what she could, and her parents were at the wedding, watching their daughter marry a wizard in a field full of red-haired strangers, doing their best to follow a world that ran on rules they would never quite learn. The Weasleys, for their part, simply absorbed Hermione the way they had absorbed Harry. She had been at the Burrow every summer for years. Mrs. Weasley already thought of her as a daughter, and there had been a stretch, during the worst of the war's rumours, when the Weasleys had worried more about Hermione's safety than about almost anyone's. Marrying Ron made official what had been true in everyone's heart for a long while. She was a Weasley now, and the family that had so little when Ron was a boy, and so much more by the time he was a man, welcomed her into the middle of all its noise, warmth. The marriage that followed was the kind that works precisely because it should not. On paper they were mismatched. Hermione was driven and exacting, the cleverest person in nearly any room she entered, with a low tolerance for foolishness and a tendency to be right and to know it. Ron was relaxed and funny and steady, more comfortable with people than she was, quicker to forgive and slower to fret, content to be the second cleverest person in the room, as long as the room was a happy one. They drove each other mad. They always had, but the maddening was the surface of something solid, and the years proved it out. He grounded her when she wound herself too tight. She pushed him when he might have drifted. He could make her laugh when nothing and no one else could. She could make him braver than he believed he was. They had walked across the whole of the worst year of their lives side by side, and they had seen each other at their most frightened and their most broken, and they had chosen each other anyway, with their eyes fully open. That is a stronger foundation than any amount of easy compatibility. They settled into a life that suited them. Ron worked at the joke shop alongside George, and he was happy there in a way the oral life had never made him, surrounded by laughter and surrounded by family, helping to run a business that put smiles on faces for a living. He turned out to have a good head for it, and the public loved him. The famous war hero behind the counter, handing out exploding sweets with a grin. Hermione drove her career forward through the ministry with the same fierce focus she brought to everything, and Ron was proud of her without a flicker of the small-mindedness that lets some men resent a brilliant wife. He had spent his childhood as one of many siblings, often overlooked, often outshone, and rather than turning him bitter, it had made him generous. He liked that she was extraordinary. He told anyone who would listen. In time, the two of them would have children of their own, a daughter and then a son, and the daughter in particular would inherit her mother's formidable mind and her father's easy warmth and grow up to be one of the brightest of the next generation. But that, like so much in this story, lies a little further down the years. For now they were a young married couple in a city at peace, arguing happily over breakfast, building the ordinary life they had earned through a very unordinary adventure. There is a pattern, you may have noticed, running through all of this. Same word keeps coming up, in different shapes. Ordinary. After everything these people went through, after the prophecies and the battles and the deaths, what they wanted and what they built was ordinariness. A home, a marriage, a job that meant something, a table full of family. The whole vast machinery of the war had been turned, in the end, toward securing for these few people the right to live the kind of unremarkable happy life that most of the world takes for granted. That was the prize. Not glory, not power, the chance to be unremarkable in peace, and they spent the years claiming it, one quiet day at a time. Not everyone found their way to that ordinariness as smoothly, though. Some of the people we have been following had a much harder climb out of the war's shadow. The hardest climb of all belonged to a young man who had lost the other half of himself. We have touched on George Weasley already, sitting silent over his twin's grave. It is time to follow him properly, because his slow road from that grief back toward a life worth living is one of the most moving threads in the whole of these 19 years, and because, against every expectation anyone had for him in those first dark weeks, George Weasley's story does not end in sorrow. It ends in a house full of children, and a name passed on, and laughter returning to a man who once believed he would never laugh again. That George Weasley lost more in the war than almost anyone, because he lost the one person he had never spent a day without. To understand it, you have to understand what Fred and George had been. They were not merely brothers, and not merely twins. They were a single act performed by two people, a partnership so complete that they finished each other's jokes and shared each other's thoughts and had built, between them, an entire identity that neither one possessed alone. They had been inseparable from birth. They had left school together, scorning the exams, to start a business together on a wing and a prayer. Every plan George had ever made for his life had a Fred in it, and then, in a single instant in a collapsing corridor, Fred was gone, and George was left as a half that had to learn to be a whole. The first year was the worst. He went through the motions. He grieved in a way that frightened the people who loved him, not loudly, but with a flatness, a going out of the light in him that had always been the brightest in any room. There were days he could not bring himself to open the shop. There were jokes he could not make, because making them only reminded him of the missing voice that should have been finishing them. His family watched and worried and gave him room and waited, because there is nothing you can do for a grief like that except be present and patient and refuse to give up on the person inside it. What pulled him back, slowly, was a combination of things, none of them dramatic. There was the shop which needed running, and which Ron came to help him run, so that George was not alone behind the counter. There was the work itself, the daily business of inventing new ways to make people laugh, which is hard to do for years on end, without some of the laughter leaking back into you. And there was Angelina. If you are still with me, somewhere on the edge of sleep, I hope the night has been kind to you so far. There is a long way still to go, and you do not need to stay awake for any of it. Let the story keep running on without you, and before you slip all the way under, if this has helped quiet your mind tonight, you might leave a like on the video, or a single word in the comments, just so this little corner of the dark can keep finding people who need it. That is all. Now let your thoughts go loose again, and let me carry the rest. We are not nearly finished, and there is nothing for you to do but rest. Angelina Johnson had been at school with the twins, a year ahead of Harry, talented and level-headed witch who had played on the same Quidditch team and known Fred and George for years. There was a tender, complicated detail tucked into her history with the family, the kind of thing that makes a true story ache in a way an invented one rarely does. Years before, when they were all still in school, Angelina had gone to a great winter ball on Fred's arm. She had been Fred's friend, Fred's date, part of Fred's world. And in the years after the war, she and George, drawn together by shared history and shared grief, and the long, slow comfort of someone who had known the brother he lost, fell in love. There is nothing tidy about that. It would be easy to make it sound strange. In truth, it was the opposite of strange. It was two people who had both loved Fred, finding in each other a place where that love did not have to be explained, and building something new out of the wreckage, without pretending the wreckage was not there. George married Angelina, the man who had believed, in the flat grey months after the battle, that the best of his life was buried in the ground, stood up at his own wedding and began again. And the marriage was a good one, warm and steady, a partnership between two people who understood each other's losses without needing to speak of them constantly. They had children, in time, and the first of those children carried the name that tells you everything about how George had come through his grief. He named his son Fred. Think about what that takes. To lose your twin, your other self, person whose absence is a wound that never fully closes. And then when your own son is born, to give that son the name, not as a tombstone, not as a daily fresh stab of pain, but as a gift, a way of keeping the brightest person you ever knew alive, in the sound of a name spoken across a happy house. That is not forgetting. George never forgot and never stopped missing Fred, and the people who knew him best could see the shadow of it in him for the rest of his life. But he had found a way to let the name mean love again instead of only loss. Young Fred Weasley grew up never knowing the uncle he was named for, but he grew up in a house where that uncle was spoken of with laughter rather than only tears, and that is the truest kind of remembering there is. George and Angelina had a daughter too, a girl named Roxanne, and the two children grew up in and around the joke shop in the bright loud heart of magical London, the children of a man who had turned his grief over many years back into joy. The shop itself only grew. Across these 19 years, Weasley's Wizarding Wheezers became an institution, expanding, branching out, a place that generations of children would beg their parents to take them to. And every product on its shelves, every trick and treat, and exploding novelty, was in some sense a monument to the brother who had helped dream the whole thing up and had not lived to see how far it would go. George built an empire of laughter on the foundation of the worst loss of his life, and he did it without letting the loss turn him bitter. And of all the quiet triumphs in these years, his may be the bravest, because it was won against the hardest enemy of all, which is despair. The Weasley family, which had walked into the war whole, and walked out with a Fred-shaped hole torn in the middle of it, slowly knit itself back together across these years. George was one part of that knitting, but there were others scattered to their own corners, each rebuilding a life, and the family as a whole grew larger and louder and happier than it had ever been, even with the missing chair that no one ever filled. To see that, we should look at the rest of them, the brothers and the lives they built, because the Weasleys are, in many ways, the warm beating heart of this whole long story of recovery. The Weasley brothers had always been a crowd, and across these years that crowd became a small dynasty. Bill, the eldest, had married during the war itself, in a wedding at the Burrow that had been broken up by the news that the ministry had fallen, sending the guests scattering into the night. He had married Fleur Delacour, a part Vila witch of dazzling looks and unexpected steel, who had silenced the whole family's early doubts about her by standing by Bill without hesitation after he was savaged by a werewolf and left scarred. The attack had not turned him into a true werewolf, but it had marked his for life, and given him a new fondness for very rare steak, and Fleur had loved him through all of it, fierce and unbothered, which had won her the family's heart for good. Bill and Fleur had children across these years, and the eldest of them carried a date as a kind of secret memorial. Their first daughter, Victoire, was born on the 2nd of May, the same date, years on as the battle that had ended the war. A child born on the anniversary of so much death, a new life arriving each year on the day the wizarding world paused to remember its losses. There is a gentleness in that piece of timing that feels almost designed, grief and renewal sharing a single date on the calendar, the day of mourning becoming, in one family, also a birthday. Victoire would grow into a beautiful young woman, and she will matter to the end of this story, because of who she eventually fell in love with. Bill and Fleur had 2 more children after her, a second daughter and a son, and their household by the sea became one more warm and growing branch of the family. Percy's story across these years was the story of a man earning his way back. Of all the Weasleys, Percy had been the one who went wrong. That he was ambitious and rule-bound and hungry for respectability in a way the rest of his easygoing family never quite understood, and in the years before the war, his ambition had led him into a terrible mistake. He had sided with the ministry against his own father, against his own family, when the ministry was denying that Voldemort had returned. He had chosen career over kin. He had cut himself off from the burrow, missed years of family life, broken his mother's heart, and stubbornly refused to admit he was wrong, even as the evidence mounted around him. It is one of the saddest threads in the whole family's history, the brother who chose the wrong side out of pride. What redeems Percy is that he came back, and he came back at the hardest possible moment, with no guarantee of welcome. During the final battle, Percy turned up at the castle, swallowing every shred of his pride, threw himself into the fight on the right side at last. He was there, fighting beside his family, when Fred was killed. He was right next to his brother when the wall came down. That shared horror burned away the last of the estrangement. There is no arguing with a family after you have wept together over the same grave. Percy was a Weasley again, fully and finally, and he spent the rest of these years making up for the time he had thrown away. He stayed at the ministry, but he was a different man inside it now, working under Kingsley's honest government, rather than the corrupt one he had once defended. He married a woman named Audrey, and they had 2 daughters, Molly and Lucy, the elder of them named for the grandmother, whose heart Percy had once broken and then mended. Percy, the pompous young careerist, became Percy, the devoted father and reconciled son, and if he was still a little stiff, still the most likely of the brothers to lecture you about cauldron-bottom regulations, the family loved him for it now, rather than rolling their eyes, because they had nearly lost him to his own worst instincts, and were grateful every day that they had not. Charlie, the second brother, was the one who never settled into family life at all, and was perfectly content that way. That he had always loved dragons more than almost anything, and after his school years, he had gone off to Romania to work with them on a great reserve, handling some of the most dangerous creatures in the world for a living. The war pulled him home to fight, as it pulled all the Weasleys home, but when it was over he went back to his dragons, and there he stayed. He never married. He never seemed to want to. While his brothers built marriages and houses full of children, Charlie built a life around the creatures he loved, burly and freckled and scarred from burns, the favourite uncle who would turn up at family gatherings with impossible stories and singed eyebrows and pocketful of dragon tooth trinkets for the children. Not every life has to bend toward a wedding and a nursery to be a full one, and Charlie's was as full as any of theirs, just shaped differently. He was happy. That was always enough for him, and the family learned to let it be enough for them too. He sent the children home from his visits with scorch-marked trinkets and stories that grew taller every Christmas, and that, in its way, was a kind of fatherhood spread across a whole brood of nieces and nephews rather than spent on any sons of his own. Over all of this stood Arthur and Molly Weasley, the parents who had held the whole thing together through poverty and war and loss. Arthur had spent his career in a backwater of the ministry, in a dingy little office concerned with the misuse of Muggle artifacts, a job that paid badly and that his more ambitious colleagues looked down on. He had never minded. He loved his work, with its endless supply of enchanted Muggle objects to tinker with, and he loved Muggles themselves with a delighted, slightly baffled fascination that had embarrassed his children for years. Under Kingsley's new ministry, Arthur's decency and his hard-won knowledge were finally valued the way they should always have been, and he rose to a senior position at last, a good man given real responsibility in a government that had learned the hard way how much good men matter. After a lifetime of being underestimated, Arthur Weasley spent these years respected, secure, and surrounded by an ever-growing brood of grandchildren who adored him. And Molly, the matriarch, the fierce heart of the family, who had fed and scolded and protected them all through every lean year and every terror. She had ended the war by doing something extraordinary, standing between her daughter and one of the most dangerous witches alive, and striking that witch down to save Ginny's life, a mother's fury made into something unstoppable. After the war, she did what she had always done, only on a larger scale. She presided over a family that kept getting bigger, a burrow that filled up at the holidays with sons and daughters and their spouses, and a rising tide of grandchildren, table needing more and more leaves added to it every year. There was always a chair that stayed empty for Fred. There were always more chairs being added for the children being born. That, more than any monument, is the shape of how the Weasleys came through. The hole was never filled. The family grew around it, the children. That is where this story turns now, because the truest sign that the wizarding world had healed was not the rebuilt castle, or the reformed ministry, or even the weddings, was the babies. A whole new generation, born into peace, raised on stories of a war they would never have to fight, carrying the names of the dead into a future the dead had bought for them. To meet them is to understand what the whole long struggle was finally for. The children of the next generation arrived across the middle stretch of these 19 years, one after another, into homes that had been made ready for them by people who knew exactly how precious a safe childhood was. Harry and Ginny had 3. Their names are worth saying slowly, because each one is a small act of memory, a way of carrying someone beloved or someone lost forward into a future they helped make possible. The first was a boy, James Sirius Potter. James, for the father Harry never knew, the brave and reckless young man who had died at 21 defending his wife and infant son. Sirius, for the godfather who had been Harry's first taste of family, who had escaped a wrongful imprisonment to look out for him, and had died falling through a veil while fighting at his side. 2 men Harry had loved and lost, both gone before their time, both alive again in the name of a laughing little boy who would grow up to be, by all accounts, every bit as much of a cheerful troublemaker as the 2 men he was named for had been. James Sirius was the eldest, the boldest, the one who teased his younger siblings mercilessly, and got away with it because he was so plainly full of joy. The second son was the one whose name carried the most weight of all, Albus Severus Potter. Albus after Albus Dumbledore, the old headmaster who had guided Harry, used him, loved him, and died for the cause he believed in. Severus after Severus Snape, the man Harry had hated for most of his life and come to understand, at the very end, as one of the bravest he had ever known. Think of what it meant for Harry to give his son those 2 names together. He was naming the boy after the 2 headmasters of Hogwarts who had shaped his life most, 2 deeply flawed and deeply brave men, one who had manipulated him toward his death, and one who had despised him to his face, and Harry had forgiven them both so completely that he wanted his own son to carry their names through life. Young Albus Severus was a quieter, more anxious, more inward child than his bold older brother, and he would feel the weight of his names keenly as he grew, in ways that would matter a great deal when his own turn came to board the train. But that is a story for the very end of ours. Third child was a daughter, Lily Luna Potter. Lily for Harry's mother, that, the woman who had died throwing herself between her baby and a killing curse, whose love had left a protection on Harry that lasted for years and saved his life more than once. And Luna, for Luna Lovegood, the strange, serene, fiercely loyal friend who had stood by Harry through the worst of it and never once wavered. One name from the dead and one from the living. Lily Luna was the youngest, doted on by her brothers even as they tormented her, the baby of the family in a house that had finally become everything Harry had longed for as a lonely boy in a cupboard. 3 children, then, in the house that had once belonged to the darkest of the pure-blood families, growing up loved and safe and loud, carrying between them the names of 5 people, some lost to the war and some who had survived it, all of them woven now into the everyday life of a family at peace. Ron and Hermione had 2 children of their own, and their names were gentler, less freighted with loss, which suited the easier weather of their parents' lives. Their first was a daughter, Rose, born around the same time as Harry's middle son, so that the 2 cousins grew up close in age and in time would board the train together. Rose was, predictably and wonderfully, her mother's daughter in the ways that counted most. She was clever, formidably so, quick to learn and quicker to correct, with Hermione's instinct for being right and Ron's instinct for being liked, a combination that made her one of the brightest stars of the rising generation. There was a running family joke, only half a joke, that Hermione had begun coaching the girl academically before she could properly walk. Their second was a son, Hugo, younger, easier, more like his father, content to grow up in the long shadow of his brilliant sister, without any of the resentment that might have grown in a smaller, hearted child. The Granger Weasley household was a happy, slightly chaotic place, full of books and laughter, and the comfortable bickering that was the native language of Ron and Hermione's whole life together, and the 2 children grew up steeped in it. These 5 children, the 3 Potters and the 2 Granger Weasleys, were cousins in everything but blood, in and out of one another's houses, raised almost as one extended brood, and they were only the centre of it. There were the children of all the Weasley brothers besides, Bill's brood and Percy's daughters, and George's Fred and Roxanne, a whole swarm of cousins of every age, descending on the Burrow at the holidays, in numbers that would have been unthinkable a generation before. Molly Weasley, who had raised 7 children in genteel poverty, now presided over a Christmas table that groaned under the weight of grandchildren, and if she sometimes had to dab her eyes at the sight of it, thinking of the one grandchild's father who would never sit there again, she also knew, better than anyone, what it had all been for. This was the answer to the whole long war, not a monument, not a holiday, this. A generation of children who would grow up never knowing terror, never flinching at a knock on the door, never having to learn which names were too dangerous to say aloud. Children whose biggest worries would be exams and Quidditch, and which house they would be sorted into, the ordinary worries of an ordinary childhood, which is the rarest and most valuable gift a generation can hand to the one that follows it. The people who fought the war had bought these children their ordinariness at a terrible price, and the children, in the way of children everywhere, would grow up taking it entirely for granted, which is exactly as it should be. A childhood you can take for granted is the whole point. There was one child of this generation, though, who stood a little apart from the rest, older than all of them, carrying a heavier history. He had been born at the very start of these years, in the last weeks of the war, and both his parents had died before he was 2 months old. We have not forgotten him. His name was Teddy Lupin, and the promise Harry made over his cot was one of the threads that ran, unbroken, through the whole of these 19 years. Teddy Lupin grew up, against the odds, into one of the happiest children in this whole story, and that happiness was built by two people who refused to let his beginning define his life. The first was his grandmother. Andromeda Tonks raised the boy in the house she had once shared with the husband the war had taken. Surrounded by the memory of the daughter the war had also taken, and she did it without letting any of that grief settle onto the child. That is a remarkable act of love when you think about it. She had every reason in the world to be broken, and she had a baby who needed her not to be. So she got up every morning and she fed him and she changed him and she taught him to walk and to talk. And as he grew, she told him about his parents, his clever, brave mother and his gentle, scholarly father, told the stories warmly and often, so that Teddy grew up knowing exactly who he came from, even though he could not remember a moment of their company. She gave him his history as a gift, rather than a wound. Children become, in large part, the story they are told about themselves, and the story Andromeda told Teddy was one of love and courage and pride, and so that is the boy he became. The second was Harry. Promise Harry had made, half over Lupin's wishes before the man died, and half over the baby's cot afterward, was not a promise he let fade once life got busy. He kept it, year after year, in the plain unglamorous way that promises are actually kept, by showing up. Teddy was a constant presence in Harry's life, and in time, in the life of Harry's own family. He came for holidays and for ordinary weekends. He was there so often that Harry's children grew up regarding him not as some distant relative, but as an older brother, the big cool boy who could do things they couldn't, whose hair changed color when he laughed, who let them tag along and teased them with affection. There is a photograph of how it worked, in the way these things settle into a family's rhythm without anyone deciding it formally. Teddy simply belonged. The orphan whose parents had died in the war became a beloved fixture at the table of the man his father had asked to look after him, and the looking after turned, as the best looking after does, into simple family. Teddy had inherited his mother's gift, the ability to change his appearance at will, and in particular her trick of changing the color of his hair to match his mood. He could turn it turquoise when he was content, an alarmed shade of pink when he was startled, that, any color he pleased when he wanted to make the younger children laugh. It was a daily, living reminder of the mother he never knew, woven right into his body, and rather than making him sad, it seemed to delight him, piece of her that he carried everywhere and could share with anyone who looked at him. He grew into a cheerful, popular, easygoing young man, well liked at school, comfortable in his own skin, the furthest thing imaginable from the sad orphan a crueler story might have made of him, and he fell in love. The girl was Victoire Weasley, Bill and Fleur's eldest, the one born on the anniversary of the battle. The two of them had grown up around the edges of the same enormous extended family, and somewhere in their teenage years, the childhood familiarity turned into something else. By the end of these 19 years, on the very day our story is building toward, Teddy Lupin would be found in a corner of the train station, kissing Victoire Weasley with wholehearted disregard for an audience that only young people in love can manage, while Harry's children watched and giggled and reported it gleefully to their parents. It is a small, ordinary, almost comic detail. It is also, if you let it land, one of the most quietly hopeful things in the entire saga. Consider the arithmetic of it. Teddy was born in the last weeks of the war, his parents killed days later, the child of one of the conflict's bitterest losses. Victoire was born on the second anniversary of that war's final battle, into the family that had paid as heavily as any. Two children, both shaped by the same catastrophe before they were old enough to know it, growing up in the peace that catastrophe purchased, and finding each other, and falling in love, 2 decades on, with the whole sorrowful past softened into family history behind them. The war took Teddy's parents. The peace gave him Victoire. That is the trade these 19 years were making, over and over, in 1,000 quiet ways, loss on one side of the ledger and new life on the other, and slowly, year by year, the new life pulling ahead, Andromeda, who had begun this stretch of time as a woman who had lost almost everyone, ended it as a grandmother watching her grandson grow into a happy young man with a sweetheart and a place in a loving family. It did not give her back her Ted, or her daughter, or her son-in-law. Nothing could, but it gave her something to live for, and it gave the boy a life worth living, and in a story this drenched in death, the survival and flourishing of that one orphaned child is a thread you can hold on to all the way to the end. Teddy was the bridge between the war and the peace, born in one and raised in the other, carrying his lost parents forward into a world they never got to see. And he is the right place to pause before we widen our view, because his story shows in miniature what was happening everywhere across these years. The same pattern played out in life after life, in people whose names never reached the front pages. We have followed the famous ones, the Potters and the Weasleys, the heroes whose deeds filled the history books. But the healing of a world is not done only by its heroes. It is done by everyone, in every corner, and there were others among Harry's old friends whose quieter lives across these years deserve their moment too. Chief among them, a young man who had been the unlikeliest hero of all, and who found, in the years of peace, exactly the gentle life he had always been suited for. Neville Longbottom had spent most of his school years being underestimated, and the war was where everyone, including Neville himself, finally learned what he was made of. He had arrived at Hogwarts a round-faced, forgetful, painfully shy boy, constantly losing his toad, flinching from his own shadow, the sort of child that crueler classmates found easy to push around. For years he was the comic relief, the boy who melted cauldrons and forgot passwords. Almost no one looked at him and saw a hero, but there had always been something underneath the timidity, a stubborn core of decency that would not bend, and the bad year drew it out. While Harry and Ron and Hermione were away hunting Voldemort's secrets, it was Neville who stayed at Hogwarts and led the resistance inside the school, keeping hope alive among the students under a regime designed to crush it, taking the punishments, refusing to break. And at the very end, in the final battle, when everything hung in the balance, it was Neville who pulled the sword from a hat and struck the head from Voldemort's great snake, destroying the last vessel of the Dark Lord's soul and making his defeat possible. The forgetful boy who lost his toad ended the war as one of its decisive figures. After a thing like that, Neville could have had any career he wanted. The doors of the wizarding world swing open for a hero. And there was a stretch in those early years when the most dangerous and glamorous paths were all available to him, when the boy who had been pushed around could have spent his life as a celebrated dark wizard catcher, and no one would have been surprised. He had earned it. But Neville knew himself better than the world knew him, and what he loved was not danger. What he loved was plants. He had always loved them, even in his worst school years. Herbology, the study of magical plants, was the one subject where the shy, clumsy boy came alive, where his gentleness and his patience turned into genuine talent, where he forgot to be afraid because he was too absorbed in the work. And so, when the post eventually came open, Neville Longbottom went back to Hogwarts, not as a frightened student this time, but as the herbology professor, taking charge of the greenhouses he had loved as a boy and passing that love on to a new generation of students. It was a perfect fit. The war hero became a teacher, beloved by his pupils, a living lesson to every nervous, awkward child in his classes that the quiet ones, the gentle ones, the ones who do not look like heroes, can turn out to be exactly that when it counts. Generations of students would grow up on the story of Professor Longbottom and the snake, and the man telling them about pruning mandrakes was the same man the story was about, which must have done a great deal of good for a great many shy children over the years. He married too, and his choice was as unflashy and right as his choice of career. He married Hannah Abbott, a kind, sensible witch who had been in his year at school, a Hufflepuff, steady and warm, and the two of them built a life that was almost defiantly ordinary and cozy. That Hannah trained as a healer for a time, and then took on the running of the Leaky Cauldron, the old pub that stood at the entrance to Wizarding London, the threshold between the magical world and the Muggle one. She became its landlady, and she and Neville lived in the rooms above the bar, so that the war hero and his wife spent their evenings in the warm, low-ceilinged comfort of an old inn, pulling pints and welcoming travellers, about as far from the terror of the war as it is possible to get. There is something deeply satisfying in that picture. The boy who survived the worst the wizarding world could throw at him chose, with his life, the gentlest possible existence, greenhouses by day and a cozy pub by night, and he was happy in it, and he had earned every ounce of that happiness. Neville carried one private sorrow through all of these years, though, and it should not be passed over, because it is part of who he was and part of the war's long cost. His parents were still alive. That sounds like good news, and it is the cruelest thing about Neville's whole history that it is not. Frank and Alice Longbottom had been Aurors in the First War, brave and skilled, and they had been captured by Voldemort's followers and tortured so thoroughly and so long that their minds had been destroyed. They survived in body. They did not survive as themselves. They had spent the years since in the long-term ward of St. Mungo's, the wizarding hospital, lost somewhere beyond the reach of any healing, not recognizing their own son. Neville visited them faithfully across all these years, a grown man and a famous hero sitting beside two people who smiled at him pleasantly and had no idea who he was. That his mother would sometimes press a sweet wrapper into his hand, a small meaningless gift, the only thing she had to give, and Neville would keep them, everyone. That is grief of a particular and terrible kind, mourning people who are not dead, loving them across a gap that nothing will ever close. He carried it without complaint, the way he carried everything, and it never soured his gentleness or his happiness. If anything, it deepened them. Man who has known that kind of sorrow and stayed kind is a rare and valuable thing, and Neville was exactly that. So that was Neville's stretch of these 19 years. A hero who chose to be a gardener, a frightened boy who became a steadying teacher, a man with a private permanent grief who built a warm and happy life anyway, and gave generations of children both the story of his courage and the daily example of his kindness. The wizarding world was a better place for having Neville Longbottom teaching in it, and the greenhouses of Hogwarts were never in better hands. There was one more of Harry's old friends, whose life across these years took a shape entirely her own, stranger and more wandering than any of the rest, and she had been there at the wedding, and she had a Potter child named partly for her. It is time, at last, for Luna. Luna Lovegood had always lived a little sideways to the rest of the world, and the years of peace let her go on living exactly that way, only farther afield. She was the dreamy, serene, faintly otherworldly girl who had drifted through Harry's school years wearing radish earrings and reading magazines upside down and believing, with total calm conviction, in creatures that no one else could see. People had laughed at her for years. They called her Loony Lovegood, and meant it unkindly, and she had borne it all with a placid indifference that was, in its own way, kind of strength most of her mockers could not have managed. Because underneath the strangeness, Luna was one of the wisest and most loyal people Harry ever knew. She said true things, often the truest things in the room, in a flat, unbothered voice that made people uncomfortable, precisely because she was right. She had stood by Harry when almost no one else would. She had been imprisoned and tormented during the war for her family's loyalty to him, held captive in the cellar of Malfoy Manor, and she had come out of even, that with her gentle serenity somehow intact, comforting the other prisoners in the dark. After the war, Luna did the thing she was always going to do. She went looking for creatures. She became a naturalist, a magizoologist, a traveller. She spent these years roaming the far corners of the world in search of rare and elusive magical beasts, some of them real and some of them, in all likelihood, products of the same boundless imagination that had populated her childhood. with invisible wonders, that it did not much matter which were which. The point of Luna was never whether the crumple-horned snorkack she was hunting actually existed. Point was the hunting, the open-hearted readiness to believe in marvels, the willingness to cross the world on the strength of a story most people would dismiss. She turned that willingness into a life. While her old schoolmates settled into ministry offices and shop counters and classrooms, Luna was off in distant jungles and remote mountains, chasing rumors of creatures, finding some, missing others, and reporting back with the same serene certainty she had always had. She married a man who was the only sort of man who could possibly have suited her, which is to say, a man as devoted to magical creatures as she was. His name was Rolf Scamander, and he came from the most distinguished bloodline in the whole field of magizoology. His grandfather was Newt Scamander, a famous magizoologist who had written the standard text on magical beasts, the very book that students at Hogwarts had studied for generations. A gentle eccentric who had spent his own life roaming the world in search of creatures to understand and protect. Rolf had inherited that family passion, and when he and Luna found each other, two wanderers driven by the same wonder, it was as natural a match as the wizarding world ever produced. They travelled together, hunting beasts, building a life out of curiosity and open country, and shared delight in the strange. That it is hard to imagine a happier fate for Luna than to spend her years beside someone who never once thought she was odd, who simply thought she was right. They had children in time, twin boys named Lorcan and Lysander, names as unusual as everything else about their mother, and the boys grew up in the wandering, wonder-filled world their parents had made. Luna, who had been mocked for her strangeness as a child, raised her own children to treasure exactly that strangeness, to keep their minds open to marvels, to believe that the world was a larger and more magical place than the cautious grown-ups insisted. There are worse things to teach a child, and Luna mended a wound from the war too, the same way so many of these people did. Her father, Xenophilius Lovegood, was the eccentric editor of a small alternative magazine, a man as dreamy and odd as his daughter, and during the war he had done something that nearly broke the bond between them. With Luna kidnapped and held hostage by Voldemort's people, frantic and terrified for the only family he had left, Xenophilius had tried to hand Harry over to the Death Eaters in exchange for his daughter's safe return. It was a betrayal, and it had endangered Harry's life, and yet it is almost impossible to condemn, because it was the act of a desperate father who had already lost his wife and could not bear to lose his child. Luna understood that. After the war, with both of them survived and reunited, she forgave him completely, because she understood that everything he had done, even the worst of it, he had done out of love for her. The two of them, father and daughter, both adrift in their own gentle way, went back to their odd happy life together, and the wound closed over. Luna's life across these years is the one that looks least like a settling down and is, in its own way, the truest settling of all. She did not change to fit the piece. She did not need to. She simply went on being entirely herself, wandering the world, believing in wonders, loving the people she loved with a loyalty that nothing could shake, and she found a husband and a family and a whole life that fit the shape of who she had always been. Of all the answers to the question of what happiness looks like after a war, Luna's may be the most freeing. It looks like never apologizing for your own strangeness, and finding the people and the life that let you keep it. We have followed the inner circle now, the closest of Harry's friends, out of the war and into their separate lives. The heroes settled, the orphan thrived, the hero became a gardener, and the dreamer became a wanderer. But there were other lives and other places worth looking in on before we widen our gaze to the whole world, corners of this recovering world that were part of the picture too. There was the gentle giant who had been the first to ever show Harry kindness. There was the unhappy family that had raised him, and the small, surprising thaw that came even there. There was the bank the war had torn a hole in, and a school quietly unteaching an old prejudice. Let us visit a few of them before we step back and take in the whole. There was one more figure at Hogwarts whose life across these years deserves its moment, because he had been the very first person from the magical world ever to show Harry kindness, and he never once stopped. Rubeus Hagrid was the gamekeeper and keeper of keys and grounds, a half-giant of enormous size and even more enormous heart, the man who had appeared in a storm on a remote island when Harry was 11 years old to tell him, for the first time, that he was a wizard, he was wanted, that he was not the worthless burden his aunt and uncle had spent 11 years insisting he was. Hagrid had taken Harry to buy his first wand. Hagrid had given him his first birthday cake, squashed and slightly burnt, and the first one anyone had ever made for him. From that day forward, Hagrid loved Harry with a simple, fierce, uncomplicated devotion, and across the whole of the war he had been there, clumsy and brave and weeping openly at every funeral, never anything but exactly what he was. After the war, Hagrid did what Hagrid always did. He stayed. He stayed in his little hut on the edge of the grounds, with his enormous boarhound and his dangerous taste in pets, tending the school's land and its creatures, eventually teaching the care of magical creatures lessons that terrified and delighted generations of students in equal measure. He had a gift for loving things that everyone else found monstrous, the spiders and the dragons and the beasts with too many teeth, and he passed a little of that strange tenderness on to every class he taught. The grounds flourished under him. The thestrals roamed the forest. The great hippogriff that Harry and his friends had once helped to save lived on, under a new name, fierce and proud, in Hagrid's care. There was his brother too, which is a piece of these years that few people know. Hagrid had a half-brother named Grawp, a full giant, brought back from the mountains during the war years and hidden in the forest, where Hagrid had set about the nearly impossible task of teaching a 16-foot giant some manners. Grawp had been a danger at first, baffled and violent, a creature with the strength to flatten a house and the mind of an angry toddler. But Hagrid was patient, the way only someone who has been treated as a monster himself can be patient with another, and across these years Grawp grew gentler, learned a few words, came to understand that the small people around him were not enemies. He never became tame exactly. He lived apart, in the wild places. But he was no longer a terror, and now and then he would lumber to the edge of the forest to see his brother, the only family either of them had, and that slow civilizing of a giant was one more small mending the years accomplished. And Hagrid stayed close to Harry. Of course he did. He was at the wedding. He came to the house. When Harry's children were born, Hagrid was an honorary uncle of the most enormous and emotional kind, turning up with unsuitable presents and frightening stories and tears in his beetle-black eyes at the smallest sign of family happiness. Harry's children grew up adoring him, as Harry had, because there is something irresistible to a child about an enormous gentle man who will let them ride on his shoulders and tell them about dragons. The first friend Harry ever had in the magical world remained one of his dearest to the end, and the boy who had been so starved of affection that a burnt birthday cake undid him grew up to give his own children the easy, abundant version of exactly that love, with Hagrid beaming over all of it. There was a harder relationship in Harry's life that also had to find some kind of resolution across these years, and it concerned the family that had raised him, if raising is even the right word for what they did. Harry had grown up in the house of his aunt and uncle, Petunia and Vernon Dursley, and their son Dudley, in an ordinary suburban street among ordinary muggles. They had taken him in as a baby, after his parents were murdered, and they had spent the next 16 years treating him as an unwanted intruder. He had slept in a cupboard under the stairs for most of his childhood. He had been starved of affection, blamed for things he had not done, dressed in his cousin's vast cast-offs, lied to about how his parents had died, that they had wanted above all for him to be normal, and they had punished him for the magic he could not help. and they had made it very clear, every single day, that he was a burden they resented. It was about as loveless a childhood as a child can have while still being fed and clothed, and it left marks on Harry that the rest of his life could soften but never quite erase. When the war reached its height, the Dursleys had been moved into hiding for their own protection, because Voldemort's people would happily have killed them to get at Harry, and on the morning they left the house for the last time, something unexpected happened. Dudley, cousin, who had spent their whole childhood bullying Harry, who had used him as a punching bag and led gangs of boys in chasing him, paused on his way out the door. The year before, Harry had saved Dudley's life, pulling him back from soul-sucking creatures that had attacked them both, and the experience seemed to have shaken something loose in the spoiled, thoughtless boy. As they parted perhaps forever, Dudley said, awkwardly and with great difficulty, that he did not think Harry was a waste of space. From Dudley, who had never in his life said a kind word to his cousin, it was an extraordinary thing to say. It was not much. It was, by the standards of any normal family, almost nothing. But by the standards of that family, it was a small miracle, the first genuine human feeling Dudley had ever managed to show him, and Harry never forgot it. Flicker of decency was the seed of what little reconciliation these years allowed. The truth is that it was never a warm reunion, and a story that pretended otherwise would be lying to you. Vernon Dursley never came around. He went to his grave, most likely, having never understood or accepted the magical world or the nephew he had mistreated. Petunia was more complicated because Petunia carried a grief she had buried for decades. She had once had a sister, Lily, Harry's mother, and Petunia had loved her, and envied her and lost her to a world Petunia could never enter, and her cruelty to Harry had always been tangled up with that old wound, the resentment of the ordinary sister left behind by the magical one. Whether she ever made any peace with it in the privacy of her own heart is not something the story tells us. With Petunia, the silence at the end is its own kind of answer. But Dudley was different, because Dudley had changed, just a little, and just enough. In the years after the war, Harry and his cousin remained, by all accounts, on distant but civil terms. They were not close. They did not become the kind of family that gathers for holidays. But they stayed in touch, in the careful, that occasional way of relatives who share a difficult past and a thin thread of goodwill, exchanging the odd greeting at the turning of the year. Two boys who had grown up under the same roof as enemies now grown. Men who could, at least, acknowledge each other. Dudley had children of his own in time, and there is a small, funny, sad detail in it, which is that those children were said to be rather frightened of their strange wizard relative, the famous cousin from the world they had been raised to think did not exist. It is a modest sort of ending for that thread, and that is exactly what makes it honest. Not every wound heals, not every cruel beginning resolves into forgiveness and embraces. Some relationships only ever reach a wary, distant truce, and that has to be enough, because it is all there is. Harry made his peace with the Dursleys as far as the Dursleys would let him, which was not very far, and then he turned his attention to the family he had built for himself, the one that loved him, and he let the old one fade to a thin civil thread. There is a quiet wisdom in that. You give the people who hurt you what reconciliation they are capable of, and no more, and then you go and pour your love into the people who can actually receive it. Harry had spent his childhood with a family that did not want him. He spent his adulthood surrounded by one that did. The contrast was the whole measure of how far his life had come. Not everything that had to recover from the war was a person. Some of it was places and institutions, and the long, uneasy relationships between the different peoples who shared the magical world, and one of those had been damaged in a particularly spectacular way. Gringotts was the Wizarding Bank, a vast marble building in the heart of magical London, with its real business conducted deep underground, in tunnels and vaults that ran for miles beneath the city. It was run not by wizards but by goblins, a fiercely intelligent and proud people. with their own ancient culture and their own long history of grievance, against the wizards who had so often cheated and looked down on them. For centuries, Gringotts had been considered the safest place in the world to keep anything valuable, second only to Hogwarts itself. To break into Gringotts was supposed to be impossible. The vaults were guarded by enchantments and traps and, deepest reaches, by a dragon, a great pale beast kept half blind and trembling in the dark, conditioned, through years of cruelty, to fear the sound of the instruments its keepers used to control it. During the war, Harry and his friends had broken into Gringotts anyway. They had done it out of desperate necessity to steal one of the hidden pieces of Voldemort's soul that lay locked in a vault far below, and the break-in had gone about as badly as a successful break-in possibly could. They had been discovered. They had fought their way down into the depths. And to escape, they had done something no one had ever done, freeing the imprisoned dragon and clinging to its back as it smashed its way up through the tunnels and burst out through the roof of the bank into the open sky over London, leaving a trail of wreckage and a thoroughly humiliated institution behind them. The dragon, blinking in daylight it had not seen in years, had flown off over the countryside, free for the first time in its abused life, and vanished into the wild. The goblins were furious, and they had every right to be. From their point of view, 3 wizards had broken the unbreakable, looted a private vault, freed a dangerous creature, torn a hole in the most secure building in the world. And they had done it with the easy disregard that goblins had come to expect from wizards, that, over 1,000 years of being treated as inferiors. The break-in confirmed every dark suspicion the goblins held about the people they did business with. It deepened a mistrust that already ran very deep, the legacy of centuries of broken treaties and goblin rebellions brutally put down, of wizards claiming ownership over goblin-made treasures, of a relationship that had never once been built on equality. Damage to the bank could be repaired with magic and money. The damage to the relationship was harder, because it touched an old and genuine wound. So the recovery of Gringotts across these years was not only the rebuilding of a damaged building, it was the slow, wary, never quite complete repair of trust between 2 peoples who needed each other and did not much like each other. The bank reopened, of course. The goblins were nothing if not pragmatic, and there was business to be done, and the wizarding economy could not function without somewhere to keep its gold. The wreckage was cleared, the vaults resecured, the great marble hall restored to its imposing self. Wizards went back to depositing their fortunes, and goblins went back to guarding them, and on the surface things returned to how they had always been. Underneath, though, the goblins did not forget, and they were not wrong to remember. Break-in became part of their long catalogue of wizard arrogance, one more story of the magical world helping itself to whatever it pleased, without regard for the people it stepped on. If there was any movement towards something better across these years, it came slowly, and it came in part from the wider work that people like Hermione were doing inside the ministry, patient effort to treat the magical world's other peoples as beings with rights, rather than as servants or obstacles. Goblin relations were one more front in that long campaign, and like all the others it advanced by inches. The mistrust did not vanish, but the conversation perhaps began to change. As for the dragon, no one ever knew exactly what became of it. It flown off scarred and starved, and half-blind into a freedom it had no idea how to use. And the story simply lets it go. A wild thing loose somewhere in the world, neither rescued nor recaptured. There is something fitting in leaving it there, unresolved. The war had set a great many things loose that could not easily be put back, and not all of them got tidy endings. Some just flew off over the hills and were gone. Inside the rebuilt school there was a subtler kind of healing going on, one that worked not on stones but on reputations, and it centered on one of the 4 houses into which every Hogwarts student was sorted. Hogwarts had always been divided into 4 houses, each founded 1,000 years ago, by one of the school's 4 founders, each with its own character and its own values. There was Gryffindor, the house of daring and nerve and chivalry, which Harry and most of his friends belonged to. There was Hufflepuff, the house of loyalty and patience and hard honest work. There was Ravenclaw, the house of wit and learning and curiosity. And there was Slytherin, the house of ambition and cunning and resourcefulness, the house that had, across the centuries, produced more than its fair share of the wizarding world's dark and dangerous figures, and which had as its emblem a serpent. Voldemort himself had been a Slytherin, so had a great many of his followers. By the end of the war, the House of the Serpent carried a stain darker than any of the others, and it carried it unfairly, but it carried it all the same. The last night of the war had not helped. When Voldemort stood at the gates and demanded that the school hand Harry over, it was a Slytherin student who shrieked for someone to seize him, and in the confusion the Slytherin students, as a group, had been ushered out of the castle before the fighting, sent away to safety, so that when the battle was fought, it was fought largely without them. To the people who survived, it looked very much as though the whole house had run from the fight, and the suspicion that hardened around Slytherin in the years afterward grew, partly from that night. The Serpent House became, in the popular mind, the house of cowards and dark wizards, the place the bad ones came from. It was not the whole truth, and the years slowly made room for the rest of it, because the truth was that Slytherin had produced heroes too, quiet ones, the kind whose courage did not look like courage from the outside. Severus Snape had been a Slytherin, and he had been one of the bravest people the war produced. A spy who gave his whole life and his entire reputation to the right side in secret. Horace Slughorn, the genial old potions master who headed Slytherin House, had returned to the castle on the last night, at the head of reinforcements, and fought against Voldemort with everyone else, Slytherin standing his ground when it counted. Years before, a young Slytherin named Regulus Black had turned against Voldemort in horror at what the man truly was, and had died, alone and unsung, trying to destroy one of the very pieces of soul that Harry would later have to hunt down. And it was a Slytherin mother's lie, Narcissa Malfoy's whispered falsehood in the forest, that had given the defenders their final chance. The House of the Serpent had as much claim to courage and loyalty as any of the others. It had just learned to wear those things quietly, and to keep its kindness hidden, in a world that had decided in advance what a Slytherin must be. Across these 19 years, under Minerva McGonagall's long and even-handed stewardship, the school worked, slowly, against the worst of that prejudice. The inter-house rivalries that the war had sharpened into something ugly began, by degrees, to soften back into the ordinary friendly competition they were meant to be. A child sorted into Slytherin was not, the school insisted, being marked as a future dark wizard. Ambition and cunning were not sins. The serpent and the lion could share a castle without one being the villain of the other's story. It was slow work, the unteaching of a prejudice, and it was nowhere near finished by the end of these years. But the direction had turned, the way much had turned across this stretch of time, that, away from the easy cruelty of judging people by the label they were given, and toward the harder fairness of judging them by what they actually did, very prejudice, and that very turning, would surface again at the end of these years, in the most personal possible way, that, when a frightened 11-year-old boy stood on a railway platform, terrified that the hat would put him in the House of the Serpent, and make him something his family would be ashamed of, and his father would crouch down and tell him the truth that these 19 years had been slowly teaching the whole wizarding world. The house does not make the person. The blood does not make the person. The label does not make the person. Only the choices do. Harry had learned it in the hardest school there is, and the world around him had been learning it too, year by year, and he handed it down to his son on the platform because it was the truest thing he knew. The school, then, was healing the way everything else was healing, slowly and unevenly and from the inside. But the deepest changes of all were the ones that reached beyond any single life or household, or even any single school, out into the laws and the institutions of the wizarding world itself, and above all into the government that the war had so nearly destroyed. To see the full shape of these 19 years, we have to look there too. The government had been the war's greatest casualty, in a way, and it became one of its greatest repairs. A whole ministry had been hollowed out and turned into an instrument of terror, and putting it right was the work not of days or months but of years, and the slow changing of what people were willing to tolerate. That, across these 19 years, the wizarding world itself became a different place from the one that had nearly destroyed itself. Kingsley Shacklebolt, calm Auror, who had taken hold of the wrecked ministry in those first raw days, did not let go of it. Temporary appointment became a long and steadying tenure, and under his hand the government of magical Britain was rebuilt from something rotten into something a person could trust. He had seen, more closely than anyone, how a ministry could be hollowed out from within and turned into an instrument of terror, and he spent his years in office, making sure the rot could not return so easily. He cleaned out the corruption that had let Voldemort's people take over from the inside. He brought honest witches and wizards into positions that had been held by cowards and collaborators. He insisted, over and over, in ways large and small, that the government existed to protect its people rather than to frighten them, and slowly, across the years, the institution came to reflect that insistence. People stopped being afraid of their own ministry. After the bad year, that alone was an achievement worth a lifetime. The treatment of the magical world's most vulnerable beings improved too, though far more slowly, because old prejudices die hard and laws change faster than hearts. Hermione's patient work from inside the ministry, the unglamorous rewriting of cruel rules one clause at a time, began across these years to bear fruit. The position of house elves, the enslaved beings whose servitude most wizards had simply never questioned, started to shift, by degrees, towards something less like ownership and more like dignity. The savage old laws that had treated werewolves as little better than beasts, the laws that had made Lupin's whole life a misery of poverty and exclusion, were challenged and softened. The discrimination against muggle-born witches and wizards, which Voldemort had taken to its murderous extreme, became something the new society actively pushed against rather than quietly permitted. None of this was finished. Prejudice is never finished, but the direction had changed, and that mattered. A world that had been sliding toward cruelty was now, haltingly, climbing back toward decency, and a great deal of that climb was the work of people like Hermione, grinding away at it in offices, year after year, with no glory to show for it, but a slowly improving world. The free flow of honest information recovered too, which mattered more than it might sound. During the war, the main newspaper of magical Britain, the Daily Prophet, had been quietly captured, turned into a mouthpiece that printed whatever Voldemort's regime wanted printed, smearing the people it wished to destroy, and burying the truths it wished to hide. A frightened population had been fed lies on purpose, day after day, and a great many had believed them, because believing the newspaper was easier and safer than asking questions. When the war ended, the Prophet had to win back the trust it had so thoroughly betrayed, and it did so slowly, returning to actual journalism, reporting the trials and the rebuilding, and, in time, the ordinary news of a country at peace, until it became once again a paper a person could read without being deceived, the small, strange, stubbornly independent magazine that Luna's father had edited all through the dark years. The one that had kept printing the truth about Voldemort's return when the official press denied it, was vindicated, its eccentric loyalty to honesty looking, in hindsight, a great deal wiser than the respectable paper's cowardice. A society cannot heal while it is being lied to. The return of a press that told the truth was part of how the wizarding world found its way back to itself, and the people who wrote for it across these years, Ginny among them with her sharp Quidditch column, were doing quiet, necessary work. The war itself was not forgotten, and the wizarding world found ways to hold its memory. The 2nd of May, the date of the final battle, became a day of remembrance, marked each year across magical Britain. The dead were honoured. The defenders of the castle were named. Hogwarts, in particular, kept the memory alive, with its scars left visible in places on purpose, and its quiet acknowledgements of those who had fallen, defending it. A whole generation of children grew up attending these remembrances, hearing the names, learning the story of the war as history rather than as something they had lived, and that is exactly how it should be. The point of remembrance is to let the next generation inherit the memory without inheriting the terror, to make sure the cost is known so that it is never paid again, while sparing the children the experience that taught their parents the lesson. The wizarding world managed that balance reasonably well across these years, mourning honestly without drowning the future in the past. If you want a single snapshot of how far things had come, you can find it more than halfway through these 19 years at a great international Quidditch tournament that drew witches and wizards from all over the globe. By then the famous friends were not young anymore. They were in their middle 30s, settled, parents established in their careers, and they turned up at the tournament the way ordinary celebrated adults do, drawing the attention of the press wherever they went. The reporters and gossip columnists who covered the event could not resist them. There was Harry Potter, head of the Auror office now, with a few threads of grey starting in his famous black hair and a new scar or two from a career spent catching dark wizards, still recognised everywhere he went, still faintly uncomfortable with it. There was Hermione, risen high in the ministry, sharp and composed. There was Ron, cheerful and greying. Ginny was there in her professional capacity, covering the matches for the newspaper, the most respected sports voice in the country. Luna drifted through as serene and strange as ever. Neville was glimpsed, the war hero turned professor, enjoying the festivities with the relaxed air of a man at peace with his life. What the snapshot shows, underneath the gossip, is a group of people living exactly the ordinary middle-aged lives they had fought to be allowed to live. Teenagers who had saved the world were now grown-ups at a sporting event, worrying about their children, grumbling about their jobs, going grey at the temples. The terror was a generation behind them. The danger had become a story they told. They were, in the end, the thing every soldier in every war secretly hopes to become, which is old and bored and safe, surrounded by family, with nothing more pressing to worry about than which team would win the match. There is no higher victory than that, and they had it. Hogwarts, through all of these years, stood at the centre of it, doing what it had always done. Under McGonagall's long stewardship, the school taught generation after generation of children, the war receding further into its history with every passing class. The greenhouses were tended by Professor Longbottom. The portraits gossiped on the walls, Dumbledore and Snape among them now. Watching over the place, they had both, in their very different ways, given everything to protect. The castle that had been blown half to pieces on the last night of the war became, once again, simply the school, the warm, strange, wonderful place where the children of the new generation would go to become themselves, exactly as their parents had before them. 1,000-year rhythm rolled on. There was, of course, more than one family that had to find its way through these years, and not all of them were on the side that won. We have left a thread hanging since early in this story, a family that escaped prison through a mother's lie, and spent these years living under the shadow of everything they had been part of. That, before we come to the end, to the day all of this has been building toward, we should look at what became of the Malfoys, because their quiet, uncomfortable, partial redemption is part of the picture too, and because the boy at the centre of it would have a son who, on a certain September morning, would board the same train as the children of the people his family had once tried to kill. The Malfoys lived these years in the long cold shadow of everything they had been part of, and that shadow, more than any prison, was their punishment. Draco Malfoy had been Harry's rival all through school, a sneering, spoiled, cruel boy who had grown up steeped in his family's belief that pure-blood wizards were a superior kind of person, and everyone else was dirt. He had taken Voldemort's mark as a teenager, more out of fear and family pressure than conviction, and he had spent the last 2 years of the war discovering, in the most frightening way possible, what the cause he had been raised to admire actually looked like up close. He had seen people tortured and murdered in his own home. He had been ordered to commit murder himself, and had found, when the moment came, that he could not do it. By the end, Draco was not a true believer at all. He was a frightened young man who had glimpsed the real face of the thing his family worshipped and wanted only to survive it and to keep his parents alive. After the war, the Malfoys went home, free but disgraced, their name a byword for everything that had failed and fallen. The grand old family that had measured its worth in bloodline and influence found itself scorned in the very circles it had once dominated, treated with cold suspicion by a society that had not forgotten which side they had been on. Lucius, the proud patriarch, lived out, his years diminished, his power gone, his name ruined, which, for a man who had valued power and name above all else, was a slow and fitting sentence. The family kept its wealth and its great house, lost everything that had made it proud. Draco himself did something his father never could have. He changed, at least part way, and he chose to raise his own child differently. He married a witch named Astoria Greengrass, who came from an old pure-blood family of her own, but one that had never embraced the fanatical blood supremacy of the Malfoys. Astoria had her own quiet convictions, and she did not believe that being pure blood made anyone better than anyone else. And she was determined that her son would not grow up poisoned by the ideas that had nearly destroyed his father. In this, she and Draco were largely of one mind, which created a real tension with the older generation of Malfoys, who could not understand why the family's ancient pride was being allowed to fade. But Draco had seen where that pride led. He had stood in the wreckage of it, and so the boy they raised was brought up, by Malfoy standards, almost gently, taught to value people for what they were, rather than for the blood in their veins. The boy's name was Scorpius Hyperion Malfoy, born around the same time as Harry's middle son and Ron and Hermione's daughter, so that the three of them would, in time, climb aboard the same train in the same year. He grew into a kind, clever, slightly anxious boy, the furthest thing imaginable from the sneering child his father had once been, and the relationship between the Malfoy heir and the children of the people his family had once served Voldemort against would turn out to be one of the surprising and hopeful threads of the generation to come. The grandson of a Death Eater and the son of Harry Potter, climbing onto the same scarlet train, with all the old hatred softened into wary history behind them. That is what these 19 years had made possible, even in the family that had been on the wrong side of all of it. Draco was never warm to Harry, and Harry was never warm to Draco. The wounds between them ran too deep and too old for friendship. What grew between them instead, across these years, was something cooler and more grown-up, a kind of mutual, grudging civility, the recognition of two men who had both come through the same terrible time on opposite sides, and were now both fathers raising sons in the same world. On the platform at the end of these years, when the two of them would happen to stand within sight of each other, amid the crowd of parents, seeing their children off, there would be no embrace, no reconciliation scene. There would only be a curt nod, one father to another, an acknowledgement across the gap of everything that had passed. From Draco Malfoy, that nod was a long way travelled. The boy, who had once believed Harry and his kind were beneath him, had become a man who could stand on the same platform and nod, and send his gently raised son off to the same school, and want for that son a better life than the one his own father had handed him. It is an unsatisfying redemption if you want the tidy kind. Draco did not become good in any simple way. He remained guarded, cold, marked by his history, never quite likable. But he turned away from the worst of what he had been, and he made sure his son would not inherit it. And in a story about a world recovering from poison, that quiet refusal to pass the poison on to the next generation is its own kind of healing. Even the Malfoys, in their guarded and partial way, helped the world move on by raising a son who would not hate the way they once had. So the picture is nearly complete. The heroes settled, the orphan thriving, the friends scattered into their gentle lives, the world itself slowly mending, even the old enemies turning, however reluctantly, towards something better. 18 years had passed since the morning the castle stood silent in the dawn. The babies born into the peace had grown into children, on the edge of their own adventures. Everything these people had fought for had come, in the fullness of time, to pass. And then the 19th year arrived, and with it the morning that this whole long night of a story has been carrying you toward. 19 years. Say the span of it slowly, and let yourself feel how much living fits inside a number like that. When this story began, the people at the heart of it were teenagers, exhausted and bloodied, standing in a broken castle at dawn, unsure whether the world was really going to let them stop. Now they were approaching middle age, with grey coming in at the temples and children of their own old enough to leave home. 19 years is long enough for all of that. It is long enough for a baby orphaned in the last week of the war to grow into a young man in love. Long enough for grief to change its shape from the raw open wound of those first funerals into something quieter, an ache that lived alongside the happiness rather than swallowing it. Long enough for a generation to rise that had never known fear, that would learn about the war from books and remembrance days and the stories of greying parents, the way every generation learns about the wars that came before it was born. The healing had not been a single event. That is the thing the histories tend to flatten. There was no morning when the wizarding world woke up mended. The healing was 19 years of ordinary days, stacked one on top of another, each of them small and unremarkable in itself. A wedding, a baby, a law rewritten, a grave visited, a first day of school, a holiday dinner with an extra leaf in the table and an empty chair that everyone felt and no one mentioned. The recovery of a world is made of days like that, thousands of them, and it cannot be hurried, and it cannot be seen while it is happening. You can only see it by standing at the far end and looking back, the way we are doing now, and noticing how far the people have come from where they started. By the 19th year, the children of the new generation were no longer babies. The eldest of them had already started at Hogwarts. Harry's first son, James, the bold and cheerful one, was a couple of years into his own school career. By then, coming home for the holidays full of stories and mischief, already a creature of the castle in the way his father had been. And now the next batch was reaching the age, all at once, when they too would board the Scarlet train for the first time. Harry's middle son, the anxious, inward boy who carried two headmasters' names, Ron and Hermione's brilliant daughter, the gently raised son of the Malfoy family. A whole crowd of cousins and classmates, 11 years old, standing on the edge of the same threshold their parents had crossed a generation before, about to leave home for the first time and become whoever they were going to become. For the parents, that morning carried a particular weight, the way a child's first day of school always does, only more so for these particular parents, because of everything that stood behind them. Think what it meant for Harry, especially. He had no memory of his own parents taking him anywhere, because they had been murdered when he was a baby. His childhood had been a long stretch of neglect in a house where he was not wanted. No one had ever stood on a platform and waved him off to his first day of school with love. He had gone to Hogwarts the first time alone, unloved boy who did not even know the magical world existed until weeks before, stumbling onto the platform by luck and the kindness of strangers. And now, 19 years after the war that had defined his whole life, Harry Potter was going to stand on that same platform, not as a frightened orphan, but as a father, with his wife beside him and his children around him, doing the most ordinary thing a parent ever does, which was to take his child to the train and watch him go. Everything in his life had been pointing, without his ever quite realizing it, toward the right to do something that simple. Every other parent on that platform took the moment for granted. Harry never could. He knew exactly what it had cost, and exactly how close he had come to never having it at all. The youngest of his children, his daughter, that was not old enough yet for Hogwarts, and she would spend that morning on the platform watching her brothers go and burning with impatience for her own turn, the way the littlest always does. The middle son was the one whose first day this was, and he was frightened, in the quiet way of an anxious child, frightened of a particular thing that he had not quite found the words for. The eldest was old hand enough to tease, and teasing his nervous younger brother was, of course, exactly what he intended to do. It was an ordinary family, in other words, on an ordinary morning, with ordinary worries. A nervous child, a teasing older sibling, a little one wishing her turn would come faster. Parents checking trunks and counting children, and herding the whole anxious, cheerful crowd toward the train. There was nothing in the scene, to a stranger's eye, that would have marked these people out as the ones who had once saved the world. That was the point. That was the whole point. They had fought a war so that mornings like this one could be ordinary, and now the morning was here, and it was ordinary, and that ordinariness was the most precious thing they owned. The date was the 1st of September. The year was 19 years after the dawn this story opened on. The place was a great railway station in the heart of London, where, hidden between two ordinary platforms, a magical barrier waited to let the wizarding world through to a hidden platform and a waiting scarlet train. And on the morning we have been travelling toward, through this whole long night, the families gathered there, as families had gathered there for 1,000 years, to send their children north into the rest of their lives. Let us go there now, gently, for the last stretch of our story. Let us stand on that platform, among the steam and the trolleys and the owls in their cages and the crowds of parents and children, and watch the people we have followed for 19 years do the simplest and most hopeful thing in the world. It's that. Let us watch them say goodbye to their children at the train, the way their own parents did, the way parents always have, and see how the whole long story comes at last to rest. The station was loud and bright and full of steam. Barrier between the 9th and 10th platforms looked, to any passing muggle, like an ordinary stretch of brick wall, and the families approached it casually, one at a time, leaning on their luggage trolleys, and slipped through it into a place the ordinary world could not see. On the far side waited the hidden platform, that, and the great scarlet steam engine standing alongside it, and a crowd of witches and wizards seeing their children off, exactly as there had been on the 1st of September, for as long as the school had existed. The air was thick with smoke and noise. Owls hooted from their cages. Cats found between ankles. Trunks were heaved aboard, and last instructions were called out, and small children chased each other around the legs of the grown-ups. And the whole platform hummed with the particular cheerful chaos of 100 families saying goodbye at once. Harry came through the barrier pushing a trolley, with his wife beside him and his youngest, the daughter, perched on top of the luggage where the littlest ones always want to ride. His eldest son had already run ahead, too old and too excited to walk sedately beside his parents, off into the crowd to find his friends. It was the middle son who stayed close to his father, and it was the middle son who needed him. The boy was quiet. He had been quiet all morning. He walked beside Harry with the particular tense quietness of an anxious child, holding a worry too big to say, and at last, with the train waiting and the moment coming near, the worry came out of him. He was afraid of being sorted into Slytherin. Of all the houses at Hogwarts, Slytherin was the one with the darkest reputation, the house that had produced more than its share of bad wizards, the house Voldemort himself had belonged to. The boy had grown up on the stories. He knew his father had been in Gryffindor, the house of the brave, and he was terrified that he would not measure up, that the hat would look into him and find something different, something he was ashamed of before he had even left home. It is the oldest fear a child has, dressed up in a wizard's costume, the fear of not being what your parents are, the fear of being put in the wrong place, the fear that there is something inside you that will mark you out and let everyone down. Harry crouched down so that he was level with his son, the way a father does when a thing matters, so that the boy was not being spoken down to but spoken to eye, in the middle of the noisy platform. And Harry told him the truth about his names. He reminded the boy that he had been named for 2 headmasters of Hogwarts. One of them, he said, had been a Slytherin. That headmaster was very likely the bravest man Harry had ever known. He had been a difficult man, and an unhappy one, and the world had spent years thinking he was a villain, and underneath all of it he had been braver, and more loyal than almost anyone alive, and Harry had been proud enough to put the name on his own son, to carry that brave Slytherin's memory into the world. Being sorted into Slytherin would not make the boy bad. It had not made that man bad. It would not make him anything except himself, in a house that had room for courage as much as any other. Then Harry told him the last and most important part, the part that took the fear away. He said that the sorting hat, the enchanted hat that decided where each new student belonged, took a person's own wishes into account. If it came down to it, if the boy truly did not want Slytherin, the hat would listen. Harry knew this, he said, because it had happened to him. The hat had once considered putting Harry himself in Slytherin, and Harry had asked it not to, and the hat had honoured the asking. The choice, in the end, was the boy's own. He would not be forced into anything. He would have a say in who he became. It is a small speech, said quietly on a crowded platform, and it is one of the most important things Harry ever said to anyone, that he was teaching his frightened son the lesson that the whole of his own life had taught him, the lesson that sat at the very centre of everything the war had been about. It is not the house you are born into, or the blood in your veins, or the label someone tries to put on you that decides what kind of person you are. It is your choices. Voldemort had believed the opposite, had built his whole murderous philosophy on the idea that birth and blood were everything, and Harry had spent his life proving him wrong, and now he handed that hard-won truth down to his son, crouched in the steam beside a waiting train. Your choices make you. The rest is just where you start. The boy heard it. You could see the fear go out of him, the way it does when a child finally believes the thing a parent is telling them. He was still nervous, the way anyone is on a first day. But the terror was gone, replaced by the steadier knowledge that whatever happened, he would still be himself, and his father would still be proud. By then the rest of the family had arrived. Ron and Hermione came through the barrier with their own 2 children, the brilliant daughter who was starting the same year, and the younger son who still had a few years to wait. There was the usual happy uproar of a large family meeting on a platform, the teasing and the greetings, Ron making his jokes and Hermione rolling her eyes at them, the cousins falling in together. The eldest Potter boy reappeared, breathless and delighted, with a piece of gossip he could not wait to share, which was that he had just seen Teddy Lupin in a quiet corner of the station, kissing Victoire Weasley, and the news was received by the younger children with exactly the gleeful, scandalized delight you would expect, and by the parents with knowing smiles, because they had all seen which way that wind was blowing for a while. And then, across the crowded platform, the families caught sight of the Malfoys. Draco was there with his wife and their son, the gently raised boy who was starting Hogwarts the same day as Harry's son and Ron's daughter. For a moment the 2 groups looked at each other across the gap of everything that lay between them, 2 sets of parents who had once been enemies in a war, now both seeing their 11-year-olds off to the same school. There was no scene, there was no reconciliation, no embrace, no speech. There was only a single curt nod, from Draco Malfoy to Harry Potter, one father to another, an acknowledgement that contained all the long cold history between them, and underneath it, the smallest possible measure of peace. Then both groups turned back to their own children. It was enough. From where they had started, that nod across a crowded platform was a journey of 1,000 miles, and both men knew it. The train was ready, the doors stood open, the last trunks went aboard, and the first years climbed up with their hearts in their throats, and the older students leaned out of the windows to call to their friends. Harry's middle son and Ron's daughter boarded together, cousins and classmates, and found a window, and the whole gathered family pressed close to the side of the train to wave them off. The whistle blew. Great engine began to move, slowly at first, the way it always does, and then faster, pulling out of the station in a long billow of steam. Parents walked alongside it for a few steps, the way parents always do, unwilling to let go a moment before they have to, and then the train outpaced them, and they stopped and they waved. The children waved back from the windows. The youngest Potter, the little girl too young to go, began to cry, because she wanted so badly to be on the train too, and her father held her hand and promised her that her turn would come. Harry watched the train until it reached the bend in the track, and the last carriage slipped out of sight. He kept watching even after there was nothing left to see, the way you do when someone you love has just gone somewhere you cannot follow. His son was on that train. His son, who had been so afraid that morning, and was a little braver now, was rattling north toward the castle in the mountains, toward the place where Harry himself had become who he was, toward the start of his own story. There was nothing more for Harry to do. He had said the things a father says. He had sent his child off into the world. The rest belonged to the boy now. Ginny stood beside him. She knew what he was feeling, because she always did, and she did not crowd it with too many words. She told him, simply, that the boy would be all right, and Harry knew that she was right. He raised his hand, almost without thinking, to the old lightning-shaped scar on his forehead. The scar that had marked him since he was a baby, the scar that had burned and ached and connected him to the darkest wizard who ever lived for the whole of his childhood. It was just a scar now. It had not hurt him, not once, not even slightly, in all the 19 years since the morning the castle stood silent in the dawn. The pain was gone, connection was broken. The war was over, and had been over for half his life, and the world it had nearly destroyed had healed around him into something he could hardly have dreamed of, as a lonely boy in a cupboard. He had a wife he loved and children he adored, and a family that had taken him in, and a life of his own quiet choosing. His scar had not so much as twinged in 19 years, and everything at long last, every last piece of it, was well. That is where the story is usually said to end. On the platform, with the train gone, and the scar gone quiet, and the world made well. But you and I have a little further to drift before we let go of it entirely, because there is a kind of peace in looking back over the whole long shape of it, now that we have reached the far end. 19 years. We started in the grey light of a single morning, in a castle full of the dead, with a boy too exhausted to stand under the weight of everyone's gratitude. We have come by the end to a bright September platform full of children and steam and ordinary happiness. Everything between those 2 mornings was the slow work of turning the one into the other, and we have watched it happen, piece by piece, life by life. We watched the dead be carried gently to their rest, and we watched the people who loved them learn, over years, how to carry the loss without being crushed by it. We watched a grieving twin find his way back to laughter and name his own son after the brother he had buried. We watched an orphan, left parentless in the war's last week, grow into a happy young man, kissing a girl in the corner of a train station. We watched 2 friends who had bickered since childhood build a marriage out of the bond that had carried them through the worst year of their lives. And we watched a boy who had never known a loving home build the warmest home imaginable inside a house that had once been a monument to cruelty. We watched the wizarding world itself change. A government that had been hollowed out and turned to terror was rebuilt, slowly, into something a person could trust. The creatures that had been treated as property or vermin began, by degrees, to be treated as beings. The prison stopped being guarded by things that fed on despair. A whole generation rose that had never had to learn which names were too dangerous to say. The war became history, then it became a remembrance day, then it became the stories that graying parents told their children. That, which is exactly the right place for a war to end up, locked safely in the past, where it can teach without wounding. And we watched the heroes become ordinary, which was the truest victory of all. Teenagers who saved the world grew up into tired parents with grey at their temples, worrying about exams and jobs and which house their children would be sorted into. They had fought a war so that mornings could be unremarkable, and they got their unremarkable mornings, and they knew exactly what those mornings were worth, because they remembered the alternative. There is no monument to a war as fitting as a family at peace. They built that monument, every one of them, simply by living their quiet lives all the way to the end. The dead were not forgotten in any of it. Fred lived on in his nephew's name, and in the laughter of the shop he had helped to dream up. Lupin and Tonks lived on in the cheerful boy they never got to raise. Harry's parents and his godfather lived on in 3 children named for them, growing up loved in the world their sacrifice had purchased. Even Severus Snape, who died believing himself hated and a failure, lived on in the name of a boy whose father called him the bravest man he ever knew, and in a portrait watching over the school he had secretly protected. The dead did not come back. Nothing brings the dead back, but they were carried forward, woven into the names and the stories and the everyday life of the living, which is the only kind of immortality any of us really gets, and it turned out to be enough. You have stayed with me a long way into the night, and I am glad of the company. If this story has helped quiet your mind, if it has carried you down toward the sleep you came here looking for, then, before you let go of the last of your waking, you might leave a gentle like on the video, or follow along for the next one, so that more long quiet nights like this one can find you when you need them. There is no hurry. You can do it now, or in the morning, or never at all, and either way I am happy you were here. Whatever the day behind you held, it is finished now, and you have nothing left to carry. Let it go, let all of it go. So let us close the way we opened with the light. Cast your mind all the way back to the beginning, to that first grey dawn in the mountains, when the battle had just ended, and the survivors stood swaying on their feet, afraid to believe it was over. Remember the bird that began to sing in the broken rafters, the bird that did not understand any of it, the bird to whom it was only a morning like all the others. That bird was right in its way. It was only a morning, that, and it was followed by another morning and another, 19 years of them, each one a little further from the dark, until the mornings were full of school trains and laughing children and old friends going grey, and the terrible night that had come before was so far behind that it could no longer reach the people who had survived it. That is what time does, when you give it enough of itself. It carries you away from the worst things. Not all at once, and never as fast as you want, but steadily, morning after morning, until one day you look up and find that the pain you were sure would never leave you has not visited in years, and the world you thought was broken beyond repair has quietly mended itself around you while you were busy living. Wherever you are tonight, whatever you are carrying as you lie there in the dark, let that be the thought you fall asleep on. The morning always comes, and then another after that. The night you are in right now, however heavy it feels, is only one night, and it is nearly over. And there are so many ordinary, gentle, healing mornings waiting on the other side of it for you, more than you could count, stretching away into a future you cannot yet see, but that is coming all the same. There is nothing left for you to do now. The story is finished. Train has gone north. The scar is quiet. Everyone is safe and everyone is home, and everything at the long last of it is well. Let your breathing slow. Let the last of the day drain out of your shoulders and your hands. Let your thoughts come loose and drift, the way the steam drifted up off the engine, the way the years drifted by, gently, gently, until there is nothing holding you to the waking world at all. Sleep now. You have stayed awake long enough. The castle is standing. The morning is coming, and there is nothing in the world tonight that you need to do except rest and breathe and let yourself at last drift all the way down into sleep. Good night.